There is a quiet contradiction in the human body that often goes unnoticed. The more stable our world became, the less capable our bodies seem to remain. Muscles that once adapted to cold, hunger, and long movement now tire more easily, even in safer conditions. Bones shaped by constant strain appear lighter, softer, almost as if they no longer expect the same demands. Nothing dramatic changed in a single moment, yet over time, something steady was lost. Not through failure, but through absence. It is not that humans suddenly became weak, but that the pressures that once held the body in a certain form slowly faded away. And without those pressures, the body began to follow a different path. So what exactly changed after the Ice Age that may have made the human body less strong than before? There was a time when the human body did not have the option to be comfortable, when every movement, every step across the land, was shaped by a world that did not adjust itself to human needs. During the long span of the Ice Age, environments were not only colder, but also less predictable, with shifting landscapes of ice, wind, and scarce vegetation that demanded constant adaptation. In such conditions, survival was not simply about strength in a general sense, but about maintaining a body that could endure repeated strain without rest, recover under limited resources, and continue moving even when energy was low. The human form that emerged in this context was not designed for ease, but for persistence, shaped by a continuous dialogue between body and environment, where failure often meant disappearance. When looking back to the earliest origins of our species, this pattern of pressure was already present, long before the Ice Age reached its peak. Early humans evolved in environments where food was uncertain and movement was necessary, but the Ice Age intensified these demands, narrowing the margin between survival and collapse. As the cold expanded and habitats shifted, groups of humans were forced to follow migrating animals, to navigate uneven terrain, and to endure long periods without reliable shelter. Over generations, this did not create a single type of strong human, but rather a consistent expectation placed on the body to remain functional under stress. The muscles, bones, and metabolic systems that developed were part of this long adjustment, not through sudden change, but through gradual reinforcement of traits that allowed individuals to keep going under pressure. Yet this relationship between body and environment did not remain constant. As the Ice Age began to recede, the world itself started to change in ways that were subtle at first, but significant over time. Temperatures rose, ice sheets withdrew, and new ecosystems began to form. Forests expanded into areas that were once open and harsh, and with them came more stable sources of food and shelter. This shift did not immediately transform human life, but it began to reduce the constant intensity of environmental pressure. Movement was still necessary, but not always across the same vast and unforgiving distances. Food was still uncertain, but in some regions it became more predictable than before. Over many generations, these changes altered the background conditions that had once shaped the human body so strictly. When the environment no longer demanded the same level of endurance at every moment, the body was no longer held to that exact standard. This is not a story of sudden decline, but of gradual release. Without the same continuous demands, the biological systems that had been reinforced under pressure were no longer maintained in the same way. Muscles that were once essential for survival did not disappear, but the necessity to sustain them at high levels diminished. Bones that had adapted to repeated stress began to reflect a different pattern of use. The body, in its quiet efficiency, follows the conditions it experiences most often, not the ones it faced in the distant past. From the perspective of evolutionary biology, this shift can be understood not as loss in a simple sense, but as a rebalancing. Maintaining a highly robust body requires energy, and in an environment where such robustness is not constantly required, there is no strong pressure to preserve it. Early humans did not choose to become less physically demanding in their daily lives. Rather, their surroundings gradually made such demands less constant. Over time, this changed what was reinforced across generations. The result is a body that reflects its environment, not its history. And yet, traces of that earlier world remain within us, in the way our bodies respond to stress, in the limits we sometimes reach, and in the quiet capacity that seems to appear under certain conditions. To understand whether humans became weaker after the Ice Age, it is necessary to begin here, not with a comparison of strength, but with a change in the conditions that once defined what the body needed to be. As the world continued to warm after the Ice Age, the change was not only visible in melting ice or expanding forests, but in the rhythm of daily life that humans experienced. The environment, once defined by constant uncertainty, began to offer moments of predictability, and those moments, though small at first, gradually accumulated across generations. In earlier conditions, the body could not rely on stability. Food sources shifted with seasons and migrations, and survival often required immediate response to sudden scarcity. This meant that the human body was repeatedly pushed to operate near its limits, drawing on stored energy, enduring long periods of exertion, and recovering without the assurance of rest. These patterns reinforced a system where endurance and resilience were not occasional advantages but continuous necessities. When looking further back to the origins of human evolution, this pattern of fluctuating but persistent challenge had already shaped the species. Early humans developed in landscapes where movement and adaptation were constant, but the Ice Age intensified these conditions by reducing margins of safety. What followed after the Ice Age, however, was not a reversal of this pattern, but a softening of its intensity. As climate stabilized, certain regions began to support more consistent plant and animal life. Rivers followed more predictable courses, vegetation returned in cycles that could be observed, and animal populations became less erratic in some areas. These shifts did not eliminate difficulty, but they introduced a form of regularity that had been less present before. Over time, humans began to interact with this regularity in ways that slowly altered their behavior. Instead of moving continuously over large distances, some groups could remain within smaller territories for longer periods. Instead of relying entirely on immediate response to scarcity, there were opportunities to anticipate and plan around recurring patterns. This change in behavior did not occur suddenly or uniformly, but it marked the beginning of a different relationship between the body and its surroundings. The human body, which had been shaped by constant unpredictability, now encountered conditions where effort could be distributed differently. Periods of intense exertion were still present, but they were no longer as constant or unavoidable in every environment. With this shift, the demands placed on muscles, joints, and energy systems became less uniform. Rather than being continuously engaged at high levels, the body experienced a more varied pattern of use, including intervals of relative rest that had previously been rare. From a biological perspective, this variation matters. The body adapts not only to extreme conditions, but to the average conditions it experiences most frequently. When those averages begin to change, even gradually, the direction of adaptation begins to shift as well. Traits that are no longer consistently reinforced may become less pronounced over time, not because they are harmful, but because they are no longer essential in the same way. This process does not require conscious decision, and it does not produce immediate visible results. Instead, it unfolds across many generations, through small differences in how bodies develop, recover, and allocate energy. The archaeological record, though incomplete, offers subtle indications of these changes. Patterns in settlement, tool use, and resource management suggest that humans were beginning to engage with their environments in more stable ways. This does not mean life became easy, but it does suggest that the constant, unrelenting pressure characteristic of earlier periods was easing in certain contexts. As that pressure eased, the human body was no longer being shaped by the same intensity of demand at all times. Returning to the deeper origins of our species, it becomes clear that human biology has always been responsive to environmental conditions, rather than fixed in a single form. The body that emerged from the Ice Age was not inherently weaker, but it was beginning to reflect a world where survival did not always depend on sustained maximum effort. In this sense, the change was not simply physical, but relational, a shift in how the body and environment interacted over time. Understanding this shift requires moving away from the idea of strength as a constant measure and toward the idea of adaptation as a process shaped by context. The question is not only what the human body can do, but what it is required to do, and how that requirement has changed since the end of the Ice Age. Over longer stretches of time, the most important changes are often the ones that do not appear dramatic when viewed in isolation. After the Ice Age, the environment did not suddenly become easy, nor did human life transform in a single direction. Instead, small shifts accumulated, shaping a new balance between effort and necessity. Where once the body had to remain constantly prepared for extreme conditions, it now encountered intervals where such readiness was not always required. These intervals, repeated over many generations, gradually influenced how the body allocated its resources. To understand this process, it helps to return again to the earliest stages of human development, when the species first emerged within environments that demanded continuous adaptation. From the beginning, the human body was not built for a single fixed condition, but for flexibility, for responding to what was most frequently encountered. During the Ice Age, what was most frequently encountered was difficulty, long distances, limited food, and exposure to cold. These conditions reinforced a particular set of traits, not because they were inherently superior, but because they matched the demands of that time. When those demands began to shift, even slightly, the reinforcement also began to change. The body, in its quiet way, follows patterns rather than memories. It does not preserve traits simply because they were once useful. It maintains what continues to be required. As landscapes became more stable, the distribution of effort across daily life changed. There were still challenges, but they were not always as continuous or as severe. Humans could remain in one area for longer periods, reducing the need for constant long-distance movement. They could interact with resources that returned in predictable cycles, reducing the frequency of extreme scarcity. These changes did not eliminate hardship, but they altered its rhythm. Instead of a steady pressure, there was now a variation between effort and relative ease. Over generations, this variation allowed the body to adjust in subtle ways. Maintaining high levels of muscle mass, bone density, and metabolic resilience requires consistent demand. When that demand becomes less constant, the body does not hold on to these traits at the same intensity. This is not a failure, but an adjustment toward efficiency. Energy that is not required for survival is not maintained without reason. In this sense, what might appear as a reduction in physical robustness can also be understood as a redistribution of biological investment. The body shifts toward what is most useful under current conditions, even if that means letting go of traits that were once essential. Evidence for this process is not found in a single discovery, but in patterns that emerge across different lines of research. Skeletal remains suggest changes in how bones were used and maintained. Archaeological findings indicate shifts in settlement and activity patterns. Together, these traces point toward a gradual change in how humans lived and moved within their environments. Importantly, these changes did not occur uniformly across all regions. Some groups continued to experience conditions that required high levels of endurance, while others adapted to more stable surroundings. This diversity reminds us that the idea of humans becoming weaker is not a simple universal outcome, but a pattern that depends on context. Looking again to the deeper origins of our species, it becomes clear that human biology is not defined by a single peak of strength, but by its capacity to adjust to changing conditions. The end of the Ice Age did not remove this capacity, it simply redirected it. The body that followed was not less capable in an absolute sense, but it was shaped by a different set of expectations. In a world where survival no longer required constant maximum effort, the body began to reflect a different balance between strength, efficiency, and adaptability. This shift, slow and often unnoticed, forms the beginning of a larger question. Whether what we describe as weakness is truly a loss, or a sign that the human body has moved into a different relationship with its environment, one that continues to evolve even now. For much of early human history, movement was not a choice shaped by preference, but a condition of survival that structured the body itself. Long before the end of the Ice Age, human groups were defined by their ability to travel across large and often unpredictable landscapes, following shifting resources and adapting to environments that rarely remained stable for long. This pattern did not emerge suddenly during the Ice Age, but it was intensified by it, as colder climates and changing ecosystems reduced the availability of food and forced repeated relocation. In such conditions, the human body was not only required to move, but to sustain movement over extended periods, often without clear endpoints. Walking, carrying, and enduring were not separate activities, but part of a continuous process that shaped how muscles, joints, and energy systems developed across generations. When returning to the earliest origins of our species, this reliance on movement can already be seen as a defining feature. early humans evolved with anatomical structures that supported efficient long-distance travel, including upright posture, limb proportions suited for endurance, and physiological systems capable of regulating heat over sustained effort. These traits were not designed for speed alone, but for persistence, for maintaining steady movement across varied terrain. During the Ice Age, these underlying capacities were placed under greater demand, reinforcing the role of movement as a central condition of life. The body was constantly engaged in responding to distance, not as an occasional challenge, but as a daily expectation. After the Ice Age, however, this expectation began to change in ways that were gradual but meaningful. As climate stabilized and certain regions became more predictable in terms of resources, the necessity for constant long-distance movement began to ease in some areas. Humans did not immediately stop moving, but the scale and frequency of movement began to shift. Instead of continuous migration across large territories, some groups could remain within more confined regions, returning to familiar locations as resources followed seasonal patterns. This did not eliminate physical activity, but it altered its structure. Movement became more localized, more repetitive, and in some cases less demanding in terms of endurance. Over time, this change in movement patterns influenced how the body was used and consequently, how it adapted. When movement is constant and extensive, the body develops in ways that support efficiency over long distances. When movement becomes more limited in range, even if still regular, the demands placed on endurance systems begin to change. Muscles are still used, but not always under the same sustained conditions. Joints still bear weight, but often within a narrower range of motion. Energy is still expended, but with different rhythms of effort and recovery. These differences may seem subtle within a single lifetime, but across many generations, they contribute to gradual shifts in physical structure and function. The archaeological record provides indirect insight into this transition. Evidence of repeated occupation at certain sites suggests that humans were beginning to establish patterns of return rather than constant relocation. Tool assemblages indicate activities that are more tied to specific locations, reflecting a different relationship between people and place. These patterns do not mark a complete transition to settled life, but they signal the beginning of a change in how movement was organized. The body, as always, responded to these patterns rather than to abstract ideals of strength or endurance. Looking again to the deeper evolutionary background, it becomes clear that the human capacity for movement remains embedded within our biology. The shift after the Ice Age did not remove this capacity, but it changed how often and in what ways it was expressed. The body no longer needed to sustain the same level of continuous long-distance effort in all environments, and as a result, the reinforcement of those traits became less uniform. What may appear, from a modern perspective, as a reduction in physical endurance can also be understood as a reflection of changing conditions, where the body adapts to what is most frequently required rather than what was once essential. This raises a subtle but important question. If the human body is shaped by movement, what happens when the nature of that movement changes, not suddenly, but slowly, across generations that no longer experience the same distances as those who came before? As patterns of movement continued to shift over generations, the change was not simply about how far humans traveled, but about how regularly the body was required to sustain effort without interruption. In earlier periods, movement often unfolded as a continuous thread through daily life, with few clear boundaries between activity and rest. The search for food, the tracking of animals, and the navigation of unfamiliar terrain created a rhythm in which the body remained engaged for long stretches of time. This rhythm did not depend on intensity alone, but on duration, on the ability to maintain steady output across hours or even days. Returning to the deeper origins of our species, this capacity for sustained movement was already present in early humans, shaped by environments where energy had to be managed carefully, and where stopping too often could carry risks. The Ice Age intensified this pattern, reinforcing endurance not as a specialized trait, but as a baseline condition of survival. When environmental conditions began to stabilize after the Ice Age, the continuity of this rhythm started to fragment. Movement was still necessary, but it became more segmented, divided into periods of activity followed by intervals of relative stillness. This did not mean that life became inactive, but that the structure of effort changed. Tasks could be completed within shorter distances, and resources could sometimes be gathered without extended travel. As a result, the body experienced a different pattern of demand, one in which sustained, uninterrupted exertion became less frequent in certain contexts. From a biological perspective, this shift in rhythm carries important consequences. The human body adapts not only to how much it moves, but to how that movement is distributed over time. Continuous, long-duration activity places specific demands on cardiovascular function, muscle endurance, and energy regulation. When such activity becomes less common, even if total movement remains present, the systems that support prolonged effort may be engaged less consistently. Over many generations, this can influence how these systems are maintained and expressed. It is not that the capacity disappears, but that it may no longer be reinforced to the same degree in everyday life. Archaeological and ethnographic observations provide indirect clues to these changes. Evidence of repeated use of localized areas, combined with the presence of tools suited for processing resources within a confined space, suggests that human activity was becoming more structured around specific locations. This structure allowed for cycles of work and rest that were more defined than before. Instead of moving continuously through the landscape, humans could return to the same sites, creating a different temporal pattern of activity. This pattern introduced variability into how the body was used, alternating between effort and recovery in ways that were less dictated by immediate necessity and more by emerging routines. Looking back again to the earliest stages of human evolution, it becomes clear that the body is responsive to patterns rather than isolated events. A single instance of long-distance travel does not define the body, but repeated patterns of such travel over generations do. When those patterns begin to change even gradually, the direction of adaptation follows. The body adjusts to the most common experiences it encounters, not to the most extreme ones it occasionally faces. As sustained, uninterrupted movement became less central in some environments, the emphasis of physical adaptation began to shift toward different balances of strength, endurance, and efficiency. This does not imply a simple reduction in capability, but a reorganization of how the body allocates its resources. In a world where effort could be distributed across shorter intervals, the necessity to maintain peak endurance at all times became less pressing. The body, in response, may have begun to reflect this new balance, preserving capacity where needed, while allowing other aspects to become less pronounced. The question that emerges from this shift is not only how much humans moved, but how the changing rhythm of movement altered the internal systems that support it, and what this reveals about the relationship between environment, behavior, and the long, gradual shaping of the human body over time. Over extended periods, the most meaningful transformation in human movement was not a simple reduction in activity, but a gradual redefinition of what the body was required to do most often. After the Ice Age, as patterns of travel became more localized and the rhythm of effort became more segmented, the body encountered a different balance between repetition and intensity. Instead of sustaining long, uninterrupted journeys as a regular condition, movement increasingly took place within familiar ranges, shaped by the return to known locations and the reuse of established paths. This did not remove physical demand, but it altered its distribution, concentrating effort into shorter intervals and allowing for more frequent pauses. When looking back to the earlier stages of human evolution, this shift becomes more significant. The human body had long been shaped by the need to endure distance, with anatomical and physiological traits supporting efficient, steady movement across varied terrain. During the Ice Age, these traits were reinforced by conditions that left little room for extended rest. Movement was not only frequent but continuous, and the body adapted accordingly, maintaining systems that could operate under prolonged stress. As environmental pressures eased in certain regions, this continuity began to break. Movement remained essential, but it was no longer always sustained over the same durations. Instead, activity became embedded within cycles that included both exertion and recovery, often structured around specific locations where resources could be accessed repeatedly. This emerging pattern introduced a new kind of regularity, one in which the body experienced repeated use within a narrower spatial range. Over generations, such repetition can shape the body in ways that differ from those produced by long-distance travel. When movement is concentrated within limited areas, Certain muscle groups and joint motions are engaged more consistently, while others are used less frequently. The overall demand on endurance systems may decrease, even if daily activity remains present. From a biological standpoint, this matters because the body adapts to the most common patterns it experiences. Systems that are not regularly challenged at high levels may become less pronounced over time, not through loss of function, but through reduced emphasis. The body does not maintain capacities at their maximum if they are not consistently required. Archaeological evidence offers subtle support for this transition. Repeated occupation of specific sites, combined with the accumulation of tools and materials in those locations, suggests that human activity was becoming more anchored in place. Pathways of movement may have become more predictable, following routes between familiar resources rather than exploring new terrain continuously. This does not indicate a complete shift to permanent settlement, but it reflects a stage in which movement was organized differently. The body, responding to these patterns, would have experienced a different set of demands, with less emphasis on sustained, long-distance endurance and more on repeated, localized activity. Returning once more to the broader origins of our species, it becomes clear that the human capacity for movement is adaptable rather than fixed. The same biological systems that once supported continuous migration can also function within more constrained patterns of activity. What changes is not the presence of these systems, but the degree to which they are reinforced through daily life. As the need for constant long-distance movement diminished in some contexts, the body began to reflect a different equilibrium, one that balanced effort and efficiency in new ways. This shift does not suggest a clear boundary between strength and weakness, but it raises a quieter possibility that what appears as reduced endurance may be the result of a long process in which the body adjusts to shorter distances, repeated paths, and a world that no longer requires it to move as far or as continuously as it once did. As the patterns of movement continued to narrow and stabilize, another change began to unfold alongside them, one that was less visible in the landscape but deeply connected to the body itself, the way humans obtained and processed food. During much of the Ice Age, food was not only scarce but unpredictable, shaped by seasonal shifts, migration of animals, and the uneven distribution of edible plants. In such conditions, the human body developed within a framework of uncertainty, where periods of abundance were often followed by periods of limitation. This pattern did not begin in the Ice Age, but it became more pronounced, reinforcing a metabolic system that could endure fluctuations, store energy when possible, and function when resources were low. Returning to the earliest origins of our species, this ability to navigate uncertain food availability was already central to survival. Early humans evolved with flexible diets and physiological mechanisms that allowed them to adapt to changing conditions. But the Ice Age intensified the need for this flexibility. The body was repeatedly challenged to maintain stability in the face of irregular intake, drawing on internal reserves and adjusting energy use accordingly. Over generations, this reinforced traits that supported resilience under scarcity, rather than efficiency under constant supply. After the Ice Age, as climates became more stable in certain regions, the availability of food began to follow more predictable patterns. Plants returned in seasonal cycles that could be observed and anticipated, and animal populations in some areas became less erratic. These changes did not immediately transform human diets, but they introduced a degree of regularity that had been less common before. Over time, this regularity allowed for different strategies of obtaining food, including the gradual emergence of practices that would later develop into early forms of cultivation and resource management. This shift did not occur uniformly, and for many groups, hunting and gathering remained central for long periods. However, the key change was not the complete replacement of one system by another, but the gradual reduction in the intensity of unpredictability. When food becomes more reliable, even if still limited, the body encounters a different set of conditions. Instead of preparing for frequent scarcity, it begins to operate within a narrower range of variation. This has implications for how energy is stored and used. Maintaining large reserves of muscle mass or metabolic flexibility can be advantageous in uncertain environments, but in more predictable conditions, the pressure to sustain these reserves at high levels may decrease. The body, once again, adjusts to what is most commonly required. From an archaeological perspective, evidence of changing subsistence patterns appears in the remains of tools, plant residues, and animal bones, suggesting shifts in diet and food processing. These findings indicate that humans were beginning to engage with their food sources in more consistent ways, whether through repeated harvesting of certain plants or more focused exploitation of particular animal species. Such patterns reflect not only changes in behavior, but also changes in the demands placed on the body. Gathering food from known locations, processing it with tools, and storing it for later use create a different relationship between effort and intake compared to the immediate consumption of what is found. Looking again to the deeper evolutionary background, it becomes clear that the human body is closely tied to the conditions of its nourishment. The shift from unpredictable to more stable food sources does not simply alter diet, it reshapes the metabolic context in which the body develops. Over generations, this can influence body composition, energy allocation, and the balance between strength and efficiency. What may appear as a reduction in physical robustness can also be understood as a response to a world where the constant threat of scarcity is less dominant, and where the body no longer needs to maintain the same level of preparedness for extreme fluctuations. This raises a subtle question about the relationship between food and physical capacity. If the human body evolved to endure uncertainty, what happens when that uncertainty begins to fade? And how does the body change when it no longer needs to prepare for the same extremes of shortage and demand? As food sources became more predictable in certain regions, another quiet shift began to take shape, not only in how often humans ate, but in what they ate repeatedly over time. During the Ice Age and earlier periods, diets were often varied out of necessity, shaped by whatever could be found or obtained within changing environments. This variety did not guarantee balance in a modern sense, but it meant that no single type of food dominated for long periods. The body, in response, developed within a context of diversity and fluctuation, adjusting continuously to different combinations of nutrients, energy levels, and periods of scarcity. Returning to the deeper origins of our species, this pattern of varied intake had long been part of human adaptation. Early humans were not specialized for a single food source, but for flexibility, capable of processing a wide range of plants and animal products. The Ice Age intensified the unpredictability of this system, reinforcing the need for metabolic adaptability rather than stability. However, as environments stabilized after the Ice Age, certain food sources began to appear with greater regularity, and this regularity introduced the possibility of repetition. Instead of constantly shifting between different types of food, some groups began to rely more heavily on specific plants or animals that were available in their immediate surroundings. This did not happen everywhere at once, nor did it eliminate dietary diversity entirely, but it marked the beginning of a trend toward more consistent patterns of consumption. Over generations, such patterns can influence the body in subtle ways. When the same types of nutrients are consumed repeatedly, the metabolic system adapts to process them efficiently, sometimes at the expense of maintaining the same level of flexibility for other types of intake. This shift is not inherently negative, but it represents a movement away from the broad adaptability that characterized earlier periods. The body becomes more specialized in response to what it encounters most often. At the same time, the emergence of more consistent food sources often coincided with changes in how food was prepared and consumed. Processing methods, such as grinding, cooking, or storing, can alter the physical and chemical properties of food, making it easier to digest and absorb. While these changes can increase the availability of energy, they can also reduce the amount of physical effort required to obtain and process that energy. In earlier contexts, obtaining food often involved extended movement, tool use, and manual effort, all of which contributed to the overall physical demands placed on the body. As some of these processes became more efficient or localized, the balance between effort and intake began to shift. The archaeological record provides indications of these changes through the presence of tools associated with food processing and the remains of plants that show signs of repeated use. These findings suggest that humans were beginning to engage with certain food sources in more structured ways, creating patterns that could be maintained across seasons and generations. Such patterns do not imply immediate transformation, but they reflect a gradual movement towards stability in both diet and behavior. Looking again to the origins of human biology, it becomes clear that the body is not only shaped by how much energy it receives, but by the context in which that energy is obtained. A diet that is more predictable and easier to process can support survival, but it may also reduce the need for certain physical capacities that were once essential. Over time, this can contribute to changes in body composition, including how muscle and fat are distributed and maintained. The body adjusts to the balance between effort and reward, conserving energy where possible and investing it where necessary. This process does not occur with intention, but through the accumulation of small adjustments across generations. The question that emerges from this shift is not simply whether diets became better or worse, but how the increasing regularity and repetition of food sources began to reshape the relationship between energy intake and physical demand, and how this, in turn, influenced the long, gradual transformation of the human body after the Ice Age. Over time, the most important consequence of a more stable food supply was not simply that humans could eat more regularly, but that the body itself no longer had to live in the same state of constant preparation for shortage. During the long ages before and during the Ice Age, uncertainty shaped nearly every aspect of nourishment. Food could be abundant for a brief period and then difficult to find again, and this instability meant that the body was repeatedly tested by fluctuation. It had to store energy when possible, reduce expenditure when necessary, and continue functioning even when intake was limited. Returning to the earliest beginnings of our species, this pattern of irregular access to food had always been part of human life, but the colder and harsher conditions of the Ice Age made the problem sharper. In those settings, the body was not simply fed or unfed. It was trained by repetition to expect uncertainty. Metabolic resilience, in that context, was not an optional advantage. It was part of the background condition of survival. After the Ice Age, however, as climates warmed and ecosystems became more stable in many regions, the background began to change. Plants returned in more predictable cycles. Animals followed routes that could be anticipated more often, and in some places humans began to gather, process, and eventually cultivate food with greater regularity. This did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not remove hunger from human life, but it did reduce the frequency of extreme fluctuation in some communities. The body, which had long operated within a world of irregular intake and repeated scarcity, now began to encounter a narrower range of conditions. That narrowing matters. A body shaped by uncertainty tends to maintain a wide margin of metabolic flexibility because it must be ready for both effort and shortage. A body living under more regular intake does not face the same demand. Over many generations, this can subtly change how energy is allocated, how reserves are maintained, and how much biological investment is directed toward enduring prolonged scarcity. The result is not immediate weakness, but a quieter shift in emphasis. The body begins to favor efficiency under common conditions rather than readiness for the harshest ones. This process becomes even more important when food stability is paired with reduced travel and more localized activity. In earlier periods, energy intake and energy expenditure were closely tied. Food often required movement, pursuit, gathering, carrying, and processing under physically demanding conditions. After the Ice Age, in places where food became more predictable, that connection began to loosen. It became increasingly possible for energy to be obtained through routines that demanded less sustained exertion than before. This altered the balance between what the body received and what it had to do to receive it. Archaeological traces of storage, repeated food processing, and more settled patterns of resource use suggest that this change was gradual but real. What the body experiences most often, it slowly becomes organized around. If food arrives with less uncertainty, if effort becomes more patterned and less extreme, then the body is no longer being asked to preserve the same level of toughness that earlier conditions required. Looking again to the deeper human story, this helps explain why the idea of humans becoming weaker after the Ice Age cannot be reduced to a simple decline in character or capacity. It is better understood as a long biological response to changing conditions. The body that once had to endure irregular feeding, repeated movement, and environmental hardship began to live, in some places, within a calmer metabolic world. That calmer world could support survival very well, but it may also have reduced the pressure that once maintained a more rugged form of physical resilience. In that sense, the cost of stability may not have been immediate fragility, but the slow fading of a body built to expect uncertainty at every turn. If changes in movement and food quietly reshaped the way the human body functioned, the most enduring record of those changes may be found not in behavior, but in the structure of the body itself, particularly in bone. Unlike soft tissues, which rarely survive across long stretches of time, bones preserve a history of how they were used, carrying subtle traces of repeated stress, load, and activity. When looking across the transition from the Ice Age into the more stable periods that followed, one of the patterns that emerges from skeletal remains is not dramatic transformation, but gradual modification, suggesting that the body was being asked to do something slightly different over many generations. To understand why this matters, it is helpful to return again to the deeper origins of our species, where the relationship between bone and activity was already firmly established. Human bones are not static structures, they respond to mechanical load. When subjected to repeated stress, they tend to become denser and stronger, reinforcing areas that bear weight and strain. During earlier periods, especially under the demanding conditions of the Ice Age, daily life involved sustained movement, carrying, and exposure to uneven terrain. These patterns placed consistent demands on the skeletal system, encouraging the maintenance of higher bone density and structural robustness. The body, responding to these conditions, reinforced what was used most often. As the environment changed after the Ice Age, the nature of these mechanical demands began to shift. Movement, while still present, became more localized in many regions. The distances traveled could decrease, and the need for constant long-distance endurance was not always as pressing. At the same time, more predictable access to resources meant that the body was not required to sustain the same level of continuous physical strain in every context. Over generations, these changes in activity patterns influenced how bones were loaded, and consequently, how they developed. The skeletal system, like other aspects of the body, adapts to the average conditions it experiences. When those conditions involve less continuous strain, the reinforcement of bone structure may become less pronounced. Archaeological studies have identified differences in bone thickness and density when comparing populations from earlier and later periods. While these differences are often subtle and vary across regions, they tend to suggest a general trend toward lighter skeletal structures in some post-Ice Age populations. This does not indicate fragility in an absolute sense, but it reflects a shift in how the body was being used. Bones that are not subjected to the same level of repetitive, high-load stress do not maintain the same degree of density, because doing so would require energy that is no longer consistently necessary. This process aligns with a broader principle of biological efficiency. The body does not sustain costly traits without reason. Looking again to the earliest phases of human evolution, it becomes clear that the skeletal system has always been responsive to behavior, rather than fixed in a single form. The robust bones associated with earlier periods were not a permanent feature of the species, but a reflection of the demands placed upon it. As those demands changed, even gradually, the skeleton adjusted accordingly. This adjustment is not a sign of decline, but of responsiveness. The body maintains what it needs, not what it once needed. It is also important to consider that these changes did not occur uniformly across all populations. In regions where physical demands remained high, skeletal robustness could persist, while in areas with more stable and less demanding conditions, different patterns emerged. This variation underscores the idea that what is often described as a general trend is in reality a collection of local adaptations shaped by specific environments. Returning to the central question, the evidence preserved in bones suggests that the human body after the Ice Age was not simply losing strength, but was reorganizing itself in response to a different balance of activity and rest. The skeleton, carrying the imprint of daily life, reflects this shift with quiet consistency. What once required constant reinforcement began to be required less often, and the body, in following that change, left behind a record that can still be read today, raising the question of how much of what we call strength is simply the visible outcome of the pressures we no longer experience. Bone does not only preserve the outline of the body, it preserves the memory of repeated use. When archaeologists examine human remains across long spans of prehistory, they are not simply looking at shape. They are looking at the physical consequences of how people moved, carried, bent, walked, and endured. In that sense, bone becomes one of the clearest places where the long transition after the Ice Age can still be observed. The change is usually not sudden, and it is rarely simple, but across many populations, researchers have noted a pattern in which earlier humans often show more robust skeletal structures than many later groups living under more settled or less physically demanding conditions. To understand why, it helps to return again to the earliest foundations of our species. From the beginning, the human body developed in environments where survival depended on repeated strain. Early humans did not merely move from one place to another. They carried loads, navigated uneven land, climbed, crouched, and travelled over long distances. During the Ice Age, these demands remained intense in many regions. The skeleton was constantly being loaded, and bone tissue responds to such loading. It does not remain the same regardless of experience. Under regular strain, it reinforces itself. Under lighter and less frequent strain, it does less of that reinforcing. This principle helps explain why skeletal robustness can change over time without any sudden transformation in the species itself. As the post-Ice Age world became more stable in some places, daily activity did not disappear, but the pattern of activity began to shift. Some groups moved across shorter ranges. Some began returning to the same locations more often. Some handled food and tools in ways tied more closely to fixed sites than to long-distance travel. These changes altered not just how much people worked, but the kinds of stress their bones experienced. Long bones of the legs and arms, the pelvis, the joints that absorb repeated impact, all reflect these patterns in different ways. If movement becomes less continuous, if carrying becomes less frequent over great distances, and if effort is increasingly distributed within smaller spaces, then the skeleton may gradually become lighter, because it is no longer being asked to maintain the same level of reinforcement. This does not mean later humans were inactive. It means the average mechanical world of the body was changing. Archaeological findings suggest that this can be seen in reductions in bone thickness and in the cross-sectional strength of certain limb bones in some later populations. Researchers are often careful in how they describe this, because no single pattern applies everywhere, and bone differences can also reflect diet, disease, age, sex, and local ecology. Still, the broader picture remains meaningful. In many cases, bones from earlier foraging populations suggest heavier habitual loading than bones from later, more settled populations. The body was not becoming useless, it was becoming differently tuned. Looking back again to the deeper human story, this makes sense. Bone is expensive tissue to maintain. A body that does not need maximum reinforcement all the time has little reason to invest energy in preserving it at earlier levels. Biology is not sentimental. It does not hold on to physical costs simply because they once mattered. It responds to repeated conditions. If the world no longer requires the same degree of loading, then over generations bone may reflect that reduction. This is one reason why the idea of humans becoming weaker after the Ice Age should not be treated as a dramatic fall. It is better understood as a long adjustment in which the body, including the skeleton, gradually tracks changes in daily life. The human frame remained capable, but it no longer carried the exact same history of strain. And because bone records that history so quietly, it allows us to see something that muscles and effort alone do not easily reveal. That one of the deepest changes after the Ice Age may have been not what the body was, but what the world no longer demanded from it. If bone records the history of strain, then the quiet differences that appear over time are not only signs of changing activity, but of changing expectations placed upon the body across generations. By the later periods following the Ice Age, the skeletal system in many populations no longer carried the same continuous imprint of heavy loading that had characterized earlier groups. This does not suggest that life had become easy, but it does indicate that the pattern of demand had shifted enough to leave a measurable trace. What matters here is not a single moment of change, but the accumulation of small adjustments, each one reflecting a slightly different balance between effort, movement, and the surrounding environment. To see this clearly, it is necessary to return once more to the origins of human biology, where bone was never fixed in its form, but always responsive to use. Early humans did not inherit strong bones as a permanent feature. They developed them through repeated interaction with demanding conditions. The Ice Age, with its extended periods of movement and strain, reinforced that interaction, creating skeletons that bore the marks of sustained physical effort. As those conditions softened in some regions after the Ice Age, the reinforcement itself began to change. The body was no longer being asked, in every context, to sustain the same level of load across the same distances. Over time, this difference became part of how the skeleton developed. One of the more subtle implications of this shift is that bone does not simply become weaker in a general sense, but more closely aligned with the typical demands of daily life. In environments where activity is varied but less continuously intense, bones may become lighter while still remaining sufficient for the tasks required. This reflects a principle that runs through much of human biology. Systems are maintained in proportion to their use. When high levels of mechanical stress are no longer common, the body adjusts its investment accordingly. This is not a loss of function, but a recalibration of structure. Archaeological patterns support this interpretation, showing that differences in skeletal robustness often correspond to differences in lifestyle rather than to any inherent change in the species. Groups that continued to rely on extensive movement or physically demanding subsistence practices often retained more robust skeletal features, while those in more stable or localized environments show signs of reduced loading. This variation suggests that the human body remained capable of a wide range of physical forms, depending on context. What changed was not the potential of the body, but the conditions under which that potential was regularly expressed. Returning again to the broader human timeline, this raises an important consideration. If strength, as reflected in bone, is partly the result of repeated demand, then a reduction in that demand over generations will naturally produce bodies that appear less robust when compared to earlier ones. But this comparison can be misleading if it assumes that the earlier condition represents a fixed standard. In reality, both states are products of their environments. The heavier bones of earlier humans reflect a world that required constant strain, while the lighter bones of later populations reflect a world where such strain was less constant. Neither is inherently superior in isolation. Each is suited to the conditions in which it developed. This perspective helps shift the question away from simple judgments about strength and weakness, and toward a deeper understanding of how the human body responds to long-term changes in its surroundings. The skeleton, preserved across time, shows that what appears as a reduction in robustness may instead be a record of a changing relationship between effort and necessity. In that record, the end of the Ice Age does not mark a moment when humans lost something essential, but a point at which the environment began to ask different things of the body. And as those questions changed, so did the form of the answers written quietly into bone, leaving behind a trace that invites us to consider not only how strong humans once were, but what it means for a body to be shaped by a world that no longer requires the same constant strain. There are some abilities in the human body that are easy to notice only after they begin to fade. Endurance in cold, tolerance for hunger, and the capacity to keep moving despite discomfort do not leave obvious marks in the way bone does, yet they may tell us just as much about how life changed after the Ice Age. In harsher, prehistoric settings, these capacities were not admirable extras, they were woven into survival itself. During the long ages of cold instability, humans often lived in environments where warmth was limited, food was uncertain, and shelter could not always protect the body from exposure. Under such conditions, the body was repeatedly asked to endure rather than simply perform. It had to continue functioning while tired, underfed, chilled, and physically strained. Looking back to the deeper origins of our species, this kind of resilience had always mattered. Early humans evolved in worlds where the body could not depend on comfort, and where flexibility under stress was part of what allowed small groups to persist. The Ice Age did not create this pattern from nothing, but it sharpened it by reducing the margin for failure. In a colder and less predictable world, bodies that could continue working through discomfort were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce, and daily life itself reinforced those same traits through constant use. After the Ice Age, however, the question is not whether hardship disappeared, because it did not, but whether hardship remained as constant, as severe, and as physically unavoidable in the same ways. In many places, the answer appears to be no. As climates warmed and ecosystems stabilized, humans in some regions encountered conditions where cold was less relentless, food could sometimes be predicted more easily, and repeated return to familiar locations reduced the strain of constant uncertainty. In such settings, the body was not tested in the same way, not every day, not in every season, and not with the same intensity. This matters because endurance is not only a built-in trait, It is also a capacity maintained by repeated demand. A body that often experiences scarcity, exposure, and prolonged effort becomes organized around those conditions. A body that encounters them less often may gradually shift toward a different balance. From a biological point of view, this change does not require any dramatic mutation or sudden decline. It can arise from ordinary processes of adaptation and development. Traits that are no longer constantly demanded may become less emphasized across generations. At the same time, when more individuals survive under milder or more buffered conditions, the force of selection acting on extreme toughness may also soften. The result is not a humanity that suddenly becomes fragile, but one in which the old threshold of resilience is no longer maintained as uniformly as before. This idea is difficult to measure directly in the distant past, because tolerance for hunger or cold rarely fossilizes. Yet the broader context supports the possibility. Changes in movement, food stability, settlement patterns, and technological buffering all suggest that in many post-Ice Age environments, the body no longer faced the same relentless pressure to remain ready for prolonged deprivation. Clothing, controlled fire, better shelter, stored food, and more familiar landscapes all acted as layers between the body and the raw environment. Those layers did not remove danger, but they reduced the extent to which survival depended on the body alone. Looking again to the origins of human life, this may be one of the most important transitions of all. For most of human history, the body itself was the first shelter, the first engine, and the first reserve against the world. After the Ice Age, in many places, that burden began to lighten. What followed may have been a slow fading, not of human capability in general, but of the need to preserve the most extreme forms of physical endurance in everyday life. In that sense, weakness may not begin as failure. It may begin as the quiet consequence of no longer needing to suffer as often or as deeply as those who once walked through a colder world. What begins to change when hardship becomes less constant is not only the visible structure of the body, but the invisible threshold at which the body decides it has reached enough. In colder prehistoric worlds, that threshold may have been shaped by repeated necessity. The body often had to continue despite discomfort because there was no immediate alternative. A hunt could not stop simply because the legs were tired. A journey could not end because the wind was harsh. A period of hunger could not be escaped by choice. Under those conditions, endurance was not merely physical capacity in the narrow sense. It was the repeated alignment of body and circumstance, where discomfort had to be tolerated because survival required it. Looking back to the deeper origins of our species, humans did not emerge in a world designed for ease. Early human life was marked by unstable food access, exposure to weather, frequent movement, and the need to make decisions under physical strain. During the Ice Age, many of these conditions became harder, not easier, and this likely reinforced a pattern in which the body's stress systems, energy use, and recovery processes were repeatedly engaged. Over time, such repeated engagement may have helped maintain a high tolerance for prolonged effort, cold exposure, and uncertain nourishment, not because prehistoric humans were invulnerable, but because the environment left little room for a lower threshold. After the Ice Age, however, many environments began to reduce the frequency of these demands. The cold did not vanish, hunger did not vanish, and fatigue certainly did not vanish, but the body in some regions was no longer pressed against them with the same relentless regularity. Warmer climates in many areas reduced the daily burden of exposure. More predictable ecosystems meant that food could sometimes be found with less extreme uncertainty. Familiar places, better shelters, fire, clothing, and eventually more stable food routines all created a kind of buffering around the body. This buffering matters because the body does not only adapt to maximum difficulty, it adapts to what is normal. When hardship becomes less constant, the body may gradually stop maintaining the same readiness for it. This does not mean that people became weak in a simple moral or biological sense. It means the body may have shifted toward a different balance between stress tolerance and energy efficiency. Maintaining the capacity to withstand long periods of cold, hunger, or exhaustion is costly. If those conditions are no longer encountered as often, there is less pressure to preserve that costly readiness at the same level. The result may be subtle. Recovery might become more dependent on regular intake. Tolerance for extended deprivation might narrow, The ability to push through prolonged discomfort may remain present, but it may no longer be reinforced as a constant baseline. In this way, one of the quietest consequences of post-Ice Age life may have been a change in the body's relationship to hardship itself. The body was still capable, still adaptable, still human, but it may have become less centered around enduring extremes and more centered around functioning well under ordinary conditions. This interpretation fits with the broader pattern already visible in bones, movement, and food systems. As daily life became more structured, more buffered, and in some places more predictable, the body was no longer the only line of defense against the environment. Part of the burden moved outward, into technology, routine, settlement, and stored resources. Looking again to the long beginning of human history, this shift marks something profound. For a very long time, survival depended on the body absorbing difficulty directly. After the Ice Age, in many places, the world was still demanding, but it increasingly allowed humans to place layers between themselves and raw exposure. That may have preserved life more often, yet it may also have slowly reduced the need for the old depth of resilience. What changed then may not have been human courage or worth, but the frequency with which the body had to prove, day after day, that it could survive without comfort. Over many generations, the deepest change may not have been that humans stopped facing hardship, but that hardship gradually stopped acting as the most constant sculptor of the body. During the Ice Age and in the long stretches of human history that led into it, physical discomfort was not an interruption in life. It was part of the normal background against which life unfolded. Cold air, uncertain food, repeated movement, interrupted rest, and the need to continue working through pain or fatigue were not rare events. They formed the conditions under which the body grew, adapted, and reproduced. When returning to the earliest origins of our species, this pattern becomes easier to understand. Early humans emerged in settings where the body itself had to bridge the distance between vulnerability and survival. There were no stable protections waiting outside the body, no regular stores of food, no insulated buildings, no dependable systems to reduce exposure at scale. The body had to withstand long effort, shifting weather, and incomplete recovery as part of ordinary existence. During the Ice Age, that burden became even sharper in many regions. In such conditions, the human organism was repeatedly forced to remain functional under strain, and over long spans of time this likely helped preserve a broad resilience to discomfort, scarcity, and physical stress. After the Ice Age, however, this relationship began to loosen. The important point is not that suffering disappeared, because it did not, but that its rhythm changed. In many places, the environment no longer pressed on the body in the same continuous way. Warmer climates reduced some forms of exposure. More predictable ecosystems made certain food sources easier to anticipate. Repeated return to familiar places reduced the chaos of constant relocation. Better shelter, more regular use of fire, more reliable clothing, and eventually greater control over food preparation and storage all created a different condition of life. The body was still working, still adapting, still vulnerable, but it was increasingly buffered. And buffering changes biology. A body that is no longer required to endure prolonged cold as often does not need to preserve the same level of cold tolerance as a constant baseline. A body that no longer meets hunger with the same frequency may slowly become less centered around coping with irregular intake. A body that is not forced to keep moving through exhaustion day after day may gradually recalibrate what sustained effort feels like and what level of strain it is built to tolerate routinely. None of this means that post-Ice Age humans became soft in any simplistic sense. It means that the demands maintaining extreme resilience were becoming less universal, less frequent, and less inescapable. This matters because many of the capacities we associate with toughness are not only inherited, they are maintained by repeated use, by development under pressure, and by generations shaped by environments where stopping is often impossible. When that pressure becomes less constant, the body does what it has always done. It adjusts toward efficiency under the new normal. Looking across the broader pattern of human change after the Ice Age, this helps connect several quiet transformations into a single movement. Bones became lighter in some populations because loads changed. Movement became more localized because landscapes and subsistence changed. Food became more regular in some places, shifting metabolism away from constant preparation for shortage. In the same way, endurance itself may have become less absolute, not because humans forgot how to suffer, but because the body no longer had to organize itself around suffering as its most reliable teacher. Looking once more to the long beginning of human life, this may be one of the clearest ways to understand the question in the title. Humans may have become weaker after the Ice Age, not in the sense of losing humanity, but in the sense that the world slowly stopped demanding the full hard edge of prehistoric endurance from every body, in every season, across every generation. And when the world asks less of the body, with quiet honesty, eventually becomes less than what constant hardship once required. As the environment became less relentlessly demanding in certain regions after the Ice Age, another shift began to unfold more quietly, one that did not appear directly in bones or tools, but in the structure of human populations themselves. During earlier periods, survival was often tightly constrained by physical conditions. Harsh climates, unstable food sources, and constant movement meant that not every individual could endure long enough to pass on their traits. This does not imply a simple or harsh form of selection in which only the strongest survived, but it does suggest that environmental pressure played a consistent role in shaping which bodies were more likely to persist across generations. Returning to the earliest stages of human evolution, this interaction between environment and population was always present. Early human groups were small, often isolated, and subject to fluctuating conditions that could change quickly. In such settings, traits related to endurance, flexibility, and the ability to cope with stress were repeatedly tested. Over time, these conditions contributed to a population structure in which certain physical and physiological characteristics were more consistently reinforced, not by design, but by the realities of survival. During the Ice Age, this pattern likely became more pronounced in many regions. The margin for error narrowed, and the consequences of failing to adapt to cold, hunger, or movement demands could be severe. After the Ice Age, however, as climates stabilized and ecosystems became more predictable, the nature of this pressure began to shift. The key change was not that selection disappeared, but that its intensity and direction became more varied. In environments where food became more reliable and shelter more manageable, a greater number of individuals could survive under a wider range of conditions. This gradual increase in survival did not happen uniformly everywhere, but where it did occur, it altered the structure of the population itself. Instead of a narrow set of traits being consistently reinforced by extreme conditions, a broader range of physical variations could persist across generations. This has important implications for how we understand changes in the human body. When survival is less tightly constrained by constant physical hardship, the population can support more diversity in body types, metabolic patterns, and levels of physical resilience. Traits that might have been less compatible with earlier extreme conditions are no longer filtered out as strongly. Over time, this can lead to a population that, on average, appears less uniformly adapted to high levels of physical stress. Not because individuals are incapable, but because the range of what is viable has expanded. From a biological perspective, this represents a shift in the balance of selection pressures. Instead of constant reinforcement of extreme endurance, the body begins to evolve within a wider set of possibilities, shaped by factors that include environment, behavior, and social structure. Archaeological and demographic evidence suggests that human populations began to grow in many regions after the Ice Age, particularly as more stable conditions allowed for more consistent access to resources. With larger populations, the dynamics of survival also change. The success of a group is no longer tied as tightly to the physical capacity of every individual, and social cooperation can play a greater role in supporting those who might not meet the earlier thresholds of endurance. Looking again to the deeper origins of our species, this shift highlights an important aspect of human evolution. The body is not shaped in isolation, but within a network of relationships that includes other people. As environments became less uniformly harsh and populations grew, the importance of social structures, shared resources, and collective strategies increased. These factors can reduce the direct impact of environmental stress on individual bodies, further softening the selective pressure that once maintained extreme physical resilience. In this context, the idea that humans became weaker after the Ice Age begins to take on a different meaning. It is not only about changes in bones, movement, or metabolism, but about a broader transformation in how survival is distributed across individuals within a population. When the environment demands less from each body, and when the group can support a wider range of individuals, the average expression of physical toughness may change, not as a failure, but as a reflection of a more flexible and interconnected form of human life. As human populations grew after the Ice Age, the meaning of survival began to change in a subtle but important way. In smaller and more vulnerable groups living under harsher conditions, the physical limits of individuals could have a more immediate effect on whether a community endured. When food was uncertain, movement was constant, and exposure to cold or injury carried a high cost, the environment placed stronger pressure on bodies to remain functional under strain. This does not mean only the strongest individuals survived, because human life has always depended on cooperation as much as biology, but it does mean that in smaller populations facing intense hardship, the range of physical traits that could persist may have been narrower in many settings. Looking back to the earliest origins of our species, human groups were often small, mobile, and exposed to fluctuating conditions that gave the environment a direct role in shaping who survived, who reproduced, and which traits became common over time. During the Ice Age, in many regions, this relationship likely remained tight. The body was still one of the main defenses against cold, scarcity, fatigue, and distance. After the Ice Age, however, several things began to change at once. In some parts of the world, warmer climates, more predictable ecosystems, repeated use of familiar places, and later more structured food systems allowed human communities to become larger and more stable. When populations increase, selection does not stop, but the context of selection changes. More people surviving into adulthood means that a broader range of bodies can remain within the population from one generation to the next. Traits that might once have been harder to sustain under relentless physical pressure are no longer filtered in the same way if the surrounding conditions have softened, or if the group can compensate for individual limits through cooperation. This matters because larger populations create more internal diversity. Instead of the average body being shaped mainly by constant hardship, the population begins to include more variation in size, robustness, endurance, and energy use. Some individuals may still be highly resilient under physical stress, but they are no longer the only forms of human viability. Social life amplifies this effect. Shared labor, resource distribution, care for children, support for the injured, and collective knowledge all reduce the degree to which each individual body must solve the environment alone. In a colder and harsher prehistoric world, the body had to absorb more of that burden directly. In a somewhat more buffered post-Ice Age world, part of the burden could be shared. This shift is easy to overlook because it is not written in a single bone or a single tool. It appears instead in the logic of population life. The larger and more interconnected the group becomes, the less survival depends entirely on each body meeting the same extreme thresholds. Looking again to the deeper human story, this does not represent a break from our origins, but an extension of them. Humans had always relied on social bonds, but as environments stabilized and populations expanded, those bonds may have had more room to protect variation rather than merely endure crisis. Over many generations, this could contribute to a population that appears less uniformly robust than earlier groups shaped by harsher conditions. Not because humans abandoned strength, but because strength no longer had to look the same in every body. A wider range of bodies could now remain part of the human future. In that sense, one reason humans may seem weaker after the Ice Age is that physical toughness was no longer being carved into nearly everyone by the same relentless environmental pressure. Population growth made room for difference. And once difference has room to survive, the average body begins to tell a more varied story, one in which resilience is no longer measured only by cold, hunger, and distance, but by the expanding ability of human groups to carry one another through a world that had begun, little by little, to demand less from each individual frame. Over long stretches of time, the most powerful effect of population change may not be that humans became physically different all at once, but that the meaning of what counted as a survivable human body slowly widened. Earlier in prehistory, especially under the repeated pressures associated with the Ice Age, daily life often kept the body in direct negotiation with the environment. Cold, uncertain food, long movement, and injury without reliable recovery meant that physical resilience was not just useful, it was woven deeply into whether individuals could continue to function within their group. Looking back to the earliest origins of our species, humans had never survived through physical traits alone, because cooperation, memory, and shared labor were always part of the human story. Yet in harsher worlds, the environment still pressed hard enough that the body itself remained one of the main places where survival was decided. Endurance, metabolic flexibility, and the ability to keep working through stress were repeatedly tested, and over many generations this helped maintain a population in which physical hardiness was more consistently reinforced. After the Ice Age, however, the balance began to shift. As climates stabilized in some regions and resources became more predictable, human populations could grow, remain longer in familiar areas, and depend increasingly on collective routines rather than only on individual toughness. This did not happen everywhere in the same way, and it did not make life easy, but it changed the terms under which many people survived. A body that might once have struggled in more relentless conditions could now persist within a social world that buffered some of those pressures. Children, older adults, the injured, and individuals with different levels of physical endurance could be supported more effectively when food abounded, was somewhat steadier, movement was less constantly extreme, and group coordination played a larger role. Over generations this matters. The population no longer needs to be shaped as tightly around a narrow range of physically demanding conditions. More bodies can remain in the chain of inheritance. More variation can be carried forward. In this sense, what changed after the Ice Age may not simply have been the strength of individuals, but the width of the human average. The center of the population could shift because the edges no longer fell away as often. Traits linked to extreme toughness were still present, but they no longer had to define nearly everyone. This helps explain why later human populations can appear, in some respects, less uniformly robust than earlier groups. The difference is not necessarily that human biology lost its capacity for strength, but that survival became compatible with a broader range of bodies. Social protection, shared labor, and environmental buffering reduced the need for every individual to meet the same hard physical standard. Looking again to the deeper human story, this widening is not a decline in humanity. It may be one of the most human developments of all. The same species that once relied on bodily endurance under severe conditions increasingly relied on social systems that allowed variation to survive. In a colder and harsher past, the body had to solve more of the world directly. In a more buffered post-Ice Age world, the group could absorb some of that burden. That shift changed the kind of pressure acting on the body across generations. Instead of constant reinforcement of maximum physical resilience, there was increasing room for different balances of size, stamina, recovery, and strength. If humans seem weaker after the Ice Age, part of the answer may lie here. The body was no longer being carved as sharply by the same environmental knife. Human populations became larger, more connected, and more capable of carrying physical variation forward. What emerged was not simply a weaker species, but a broader one, shaped less by the necessity that every body endure the same extremes, and more by a social world in which survival could be shared. In that quiet widening of who could live, recover, and remain within the human line, the old uniform pressure of prehistoric toughness may have softened into something more varied, and perhaps more revealing about what humans were becoming. If earlier changes reduced the constant pressures acting on the human body, another process began to follow from that reduction, one that is less visible but deeply influential: the gradual shift from maintaining maximum physical capacity toward conserving energy wherever possible. In environments shaped by the Ice Age, the body could not afford inefficiency. Movement required energy, finding food required energy, staying warm required energy, and recovery itself depended on energy that was often uncertain. Under such conditions, the human organism was repeatedly pushed into a state where resources had to be used carefully, but also where the capacity to endure high output remained essential. Returning to the earliest origins of our species, this balance between expenditure and survival was already present. Early humans evolved in environments where energy intake was unpredictable, and the body developed mechanisms to store, mobilize, and ration energy as needed. The Ice Age did not change this fundamental pattern, but it intensified it. reinforcing a system that had to operate under frequent stress. The body had to be both resilient and ready, capable of maintaining effort even when resources were not immediately available. After the Ice Age, however, as conditions became more stable in certain regions, the nature of this balance began to change. Food, while still limited, could sometimes be obtained with greater regularity. Movement, while still necessary, was not always as continuous or as extensive. Shelter, clothing, and social cooperation began to reduce the direct cost of environmental exposure. In this context, the body encountered a different set of conditions, one in which the constant demand for maximum output was no longer present in the same way. When the body is no longer pushed to operate at high levels of sustained effort as frequently, a shift toward efficiency can begin to take place. This does not mean that the body becomes incapable of high performance, but that it is no longer organized around maintaining that performance at all times. Instead, it begins to favor patterns that reduce unnecessary expenditure. Energy is conserved where possible, and resources are allocated toward functions that are most consistently required under current conditions. This process is not conscious. It unfolds through development, behavior, and long-term adaptation across generations. One way to understand this shift is to consider that maintaining large amounts of muscle tissue, high metabolic flexibility, and constant readiness for extreme effort all carry a cost. These traits are beneficial when the environment demands them regularly, but when such demands become less frequent, the cost of maintaining them may no longer be justified. The body, shaped by the principle of balance, adjusts toward what is most efficient in the average conditions it experiences. Over time, this can lead to a gradual reorganization of physical capacity, where peak endurance and strength are still possible, but not as continuously supported or reinforced in everyday life. Archaeological and anthropological evidence does not point to a single moment when this change occurred, but it aligns with broader patterns already observed. Reduced long-distance movement in some populations, more stable food access, increasing use of tools and shelter, and growing population density. All of these factors contribute to a context in which the body can afford to operate with less constant strain. Looking again to the deeper human story, this shift toward efficiency is not a departure from our origins, but a continuation of them. The human body has always been responsive to its environment, adjusting its investment in strength, endurance, and energy use according to what is required. After the Ice Age, in many places, what was required began to change. The body did not forget how to endure. It simply no longer needed to organize itself around endurance as its most constant state. In that quiet shift, the meaning of physical capability begins to move away from maintaining maximum output at all times, and toward a more flexible balance between effort and conservation, raising the possibility that what appears as weakness may, in part, be the body's natural response to a world that no longer demands as much from it every day. As the body begins to favor efficiency over constant readiness, the change is not only about how much energy is used, but about when and why that energy is invested. In earlier environments shaped by uncertainty and repeated strain, energy expenditure was often unavoidable. Movement, searching for food, maintaining warmth, and responding to sudden challenges all required the body to engage its resources without the option to delay. Returning to the deeper origins of our species, this pattern of necessary expenditure had long been part of human life. Early humans did not operate within a stable system where effort could be precisely planned or minimized. Instead, they lived in conditions where energy had to be used when the environment demanded it, even if recovery was uncertain. During the Ice Age, this dynamic was reinforced. The body was repeatedly called upon to act under pressure, drawing on its reserves and sustaining activity across difficult conditions. After the Ice Age, however, as environments stabilized in certain regions, the timing of effort began to shift. Instead of responding primarily to immediate necessity, humans could increasingly organize their activity around patterns that were more predictable. Food could sometimes be obtained at known times or locations. Shelter could be prepared in advance. Movement could follow familiar routes. These changes did not eliminate effort, but they allowed for a degree of control over when effort was applied. This control, even in limited forms, has important consequences for the body. When energy use becomes more structured, the body begins to experience a different relationship between effort and recovery. Instead of constant engagement, there are clearer intervals in which energy can be conserved. Over time, this encourages the body to operate within a narrower range of demand, adjusting its systems to function efficiently under these more regular conditions. The emphasis shifts away from maintaining high output at all times and toward using energy more selectively. From a biological perspective, this shift affects how different systems are maintained. Muscles that are not regularly pushed to sustained limits may be preserved at levels sufficient for common tasks rather than at maximum capacity. Metabolic systems may become more tuned to steady intake rather than repeated extremes of shortage and exertion. Even the perception of effort may gradually change. As the body becomes accustomed to operating within a more controlled range of activity, these changes do not remove the ability to perform under stress, but they may reduce how often that ability is called upon and reinforced. Archaeological and anthropological evidence provides indirect support for this transition. Patterns of repeated settlement, the presence of storage practices, and the use of tools designed for specific tasks all suggest that human activity was becoming more organized. This organization allowed for a redistribution of effort across time, concentrating work into certain periods and reducing the need for constant exertion. The body, responding to these patterns, would gradually align itself with the most common experiences it encountered. Looking again to the broader human story, this process reflects a consistent principle. The body adapts to the regularities of life rather than to its rare extremes. When effort is no longer dictated by constant uncertainty, the systems that support continuous high output may become less emphasized. This does not mean that humans became incapable of endurance or strength, but that these capacities were no longer the central focus of everyday biological investment. In that sense, the shift toward efficiency is not simply a reduction in physical demand, but a reorganization of how the body manages its resources. It raises a quiet question about the nature of human capability itself. If the body is shaped by when it must act, then a world that allows action to be delayed, planned, or distributed differently may gradually produce a body that reflects that flexibility, one that is less defined by constant strain and more by the careful balance between effort and conservation. Over many generations, the shift toward energy efficiency may have become one of the quietest but most decisive changes in the human body after the Ice Age. Earlier in human history, especially under the repeated pressures of cold, movement, uncertainty, and limited food, the body could not simply be economical in the modern sense. It had to preserve enough strength, endurance, and metabolic flexibility to respond to demands that arrived without warning. Looking back to the earliest origins of our species, this was already true before the Ice Age reached its harsher phases. Early humans lived in environments where energy was always precious, but where saving too much of it was not an option if survival required long travel, tool use, carrying, or response to danger. During the Ice Age, this balance became even sharper. The body had to spend carefully, but it also had to remain ready for extended effort. That combination helped maintain a kind of physical organization in which toughness was costly but necessary. After the Ice Age, however, as many environments became less extreme and human life in some regions grew more structured, the body began to encounter a different economic reality. Food was not always abundant, but it could become more predictable. Movement did not disappear, but it could become more localized. Shelter, clothing, fire, and familiar spaces reduced the frequency with which the body had to absorb the full cost of exposure directly. As these buffers accumulated, the body was no longer asked, with the same regularity, to maintain maximum readiness for extreme physical demand. This is where efficiency becomes more than a simple biological trait. It becomes a long-term direction of adaptation, a body that no longer needs to sustain heavy muscle, dense bone reinforcement, high tolerance for extended shortage, and constant endurance at the same levels can gradually redirect its investment. It preserves what is useful often and reduces what is costly when rarely required. This is not because the body chooses comfort, but because biology tends to follow repeated conditions. Over time, systems that are expensive to maintain without daily necessity become less strongly reinforced. In that sense, what appears as weakness may sometimes be the visible result of a deeper logic. The body is trying not to waste energy on capacities that the surrounding world no longer demands every day. This helps connect several earlier changes into one broader pattern. When movement becomes shorter and less continuous, the body does not need to support the same level of constant endurance. When food becomes more stable, it no longer needs to prepare as intensely for repeated shortage. When hardship becomes less frequent, the body no longer organizes itself around surviving discomfort as a default condition. And when communities grow larger and more supportive, survival is not carried by each individual body in quite the same way. All of these changes point in one direction. The human organism begins to shift from maintaining extreme physical reserve toward functioning efficiently under more ordinary conditions. Looking again to the long beginning of human life, this does not mean that efficiency is somehow less natural than strength. It may be just as natural, because humans have always adapted to the balance between cost and necessity. What changed after the Ice Age was that necessity itself began to soften in many places. The body, always honest in its responses, followed that softening. It became less centered around preserving the most expensive forms of physical readiness and more centered around stability, flexibility, and lower average cost. This is why the idea that humans became weaker after the Ice Age should be understood carefully. The body may indeed have become less robust in some respects, but not because it failed. It became less robust because the pressures that once paid for robustness, day after day and generation after generation, slowly diminished. In a world that asks less from the body gives less back. And perhaps that is one of the clearest answers hidden inside this long human story. What we call weakness may sometimes be nothing more than the shape of efficiency in a gentler world. As human life became more stable in some places after the Ice Age, one of the less visible changes was that people also began living closer to one another for longer periods, and often in closer relationship with the same spaces, the same waste, and eventually the same animals. This created a new kind of pressure on the human body, one very different from cold, distance, or hunger. Earlier in prehistory, small and mobile groups often moved often enough that the buildup of waste and repeated exposure to the same local contaminants remained limited. Infections certainly existed, injury certainly existed, and parasites were always part of human life. But the structure of the environment did not always favor the same long-term circulation of disease that becomes possible when people remain in one place. Looking back to the deeper origins of our species, humans evolved in conditions where movement itself sometimes acted as a kind of separation from concentrated biological threats. During the Ice Age, harsh conditions imposed many burdens, yet the small size and mobility of many human groups may have limited the spread of some infections that thrive in denser, more sedentary populations. After the Ice Age, however, as climates warmed and local ecologies stabilized, some human communities began staying longer in familiar locations. This did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not immediately create villages in every region, but it marked the beginning of a different relationship between bodies and place. Repeated occupation means repeated contact. The ground beneath daily life accumulates traces of food waste, human waste, parasites, and microbes. Water sources used more often by the same people can become points of contamination. Spaces shared over longer periods allow illnesses to circulate differently than in groups that move before such build-up becomes intense. Over time, the body is no longer dealing only with landscape and weather. It is increasingly dealing with the biological consequences of proximity. This matters for the larger question of why humans may have seemed weaker after the Ice Age, because disease does not have to break bones to reduce resilience. A body frequently managing infection, inflammation, parasites, or repeated immune stress is a body that must redirect energy. Energy that might once have gone toward growth, repair, or physical robustness can instead be spent on defense. In this sense, a more stable world can paradoxically introduce new forms of instability inside the body itself. Warmth, predictability, and repeated settlement can reduce some environmental pressures while increasing others that are less visible but deeply costly. The body may no longer be pressed as constantly by cold or long-distance movement, yet it may begin to face a different burden: the slow biological weight of living in denser and more contaminated human spaces. Archaeological evidence supports this broader possibility, not always through direct proof of a single disease, but through patterns associated with settlement, crowding, food storage, and later the closer management of animals. As humans remain in place longer, insects, parasites, and pathogens can become more persistent companions of daily life. The body must then maintain not only movement and metabolism, but immune defense under repeated exposure. Looking again to the origins of human life, this is an important turning point. For much of early human history, danger often came from the outer environment in visible forms: cold, distance, hunger, injury, exposure. After the Ice Age, in many regions, part of that danger began moving inward into the invisible world of infection, chronic exposure, and repeated biological stress. The human body was still adapting, still surviving, still finding new ways to live, but it was now doing so under a different set of costs. This does not mean post-Ice Age life was simply worse. It means that one kind of pressure was being exchanged for another. As the old demands of cold landscapes and endless movement softened in some places, new pressures emerged from closeness, repetition, and settled living. And in that exchange, the body may have become less physically robust not only because it moved differently, but because it increasingly had to share its strength with battles that earlier humans, moving more often through wider spaces, may not have faced in quite the same way. As repeated settlement became more common in some regions after the Ice Age, the human body began to face a form of pressure that was less visible than cold or hunger, but no less demanding. Earlier mobile groups certainly lived with parasites, wounds, and infection, yet frequent movement limited how long people remained, surrounded by the same build-up of waste, spoiled matter, and contaminated surfaces. When people began returning to the same places more often, or staying there for longer stretches, the ordinary remains of life started to accumulate around them. Food scraps, human waste, stagnant water, smoke-filled enclosed spaces, and decaying organic material created conditions in which microbes and parasites could persist more easily. Looking back to the deeper origins of our species, this represents an important change in the biological environment of the body. For much of early human existence, danger often came from outside in forms that were direct and visible: exposure to weather, unstable food, injury, long movement. After the Ice Age, some of that danger began to arise from what humans themselves left behind in the places they occupied. This does not mean that sedentary life appeared suddenly or everywhere at once, but it does mean that in the regions where repeated occupation became more common, the body increasingly had to cope with the consequences of living inside its own traces. That shift matters because disease and contamination do not merely cause moments of sickness, they can create a background burden that continuously competes for energy. A body dealing with repeated infection, gut parasites, minor inflammation, or immune stress is a body whose resources are divided. Energy that might otherwise support growth, tissue repair, muscle maintenance, or recovery after effort may instead be drawn into defense. Over time, especially across generations growing up in these conditions, this can influence how physical robustness is expressed. The body may survive, but at a cost that is not always obvious in a single moment. Archaeological evidence from later prehistoric settlements often points toward these changing pressures indirectly. Repeated occupation layers, refuse accumulation, signs of enclosed or semi-enclosed habitation, and eventually closer association with managed animals all suggest environments in which the spread of pathogens and parasites could become easier than in more dispersed and mobile populations. Even before full agricultural villages, any increase in crowding and duration of occupation changes the ecological relationship between humans and microbes. People drink from the same water sources more often. Children grow up where waste is harder to escape. Insects that carry parasites or disease can thrive around repeated habitation. The body, in response, must keep fighting on a different front. Looking again to the early human story, this is one reason the idea of weakness after the Ice Age becomes more complicated. A body may appear less robust not only because it moves less or carries less, but because more of its strength is being quietly spent on survival at the microscopic level. The old burdens of harsh climate and constant travel may have softened in some places, yet new burdens emerge through density, repetition, and contamination. This is one of the paradoxes of stability. A more settled life can reduce certain extreme pressures while increasing continuous low-level biological stress. The body may no longer be tested as often by freezing wind or relentless distance, but it may be tested more often by infection that returns, inflammation that lingers, or parasites that reduce nourishment from within. Over many generations, this changes the balance of what the body is preparing for. Instead of investing so heavily in outward endurance alone, it must spend more on immune defense, tolerance, and survival within crowded human environments. Returning once more to the origins of our species, humans did not evolve only against landscapes. They also evolved within the invisible worlds that landscapes allowed or restrained. After the Ice Age, when some communities stayed longer, gathered more closely, and altered their surroundings more deeply, they entered a biological condition that earlier mobile groups may have experienced less intensely. In that sense, part of what made later humans seem weaker may not have been a simple reduction in strength, but the fact that the body increasingly had to divide its limited energy between movement, repair, and a new kind of struggle taking place beneath the surface of daily life. Over many generations, one of the quietest changes after the Ice Age may have been that the human body increasingly had to defend itself not only from landscape and weather, but from the biological consequences of living near other humans for longer stretches of time. Earlier in prehistory, small and mobile groups were not free from sickness. They experienced wounds, parasites, infections, and all the uncertainties of bodily life. Yet movement itself often disrupted accumulation. Camps were left behind. Waste was not always allowed to build in the same place. Water sources were used and then abandoned. The body still suffered, but it may have faced fewer situations in which the same contaminants, the same microbes, and the same dense social contact pressed on it again and again without interruption. Looking back to the deeper origins of our species, this distinction matters. For much of early human existence, many of the harshest pressures came from visible conditions outside the body. Cold, hunger, distance, injury, exposure. During the Ice Age, those pressures remained severe in many regions, and the body was repeatedly organized around enduring them. After the Ice Age, however, as some communities stayed longer in familiar places, gathered more closely, and began creating more stable living environments, the body entered a different kind of ecological relationship. It was still facing hardship, but now part of that hardship came from persistence rather than from movement. Repeated habitation means repeated exposure. The same ground holds waste longer. The same air in enclosed spaces can carry smoke and irritation. The same water can be contaminated more easily. The same people can pass microbes back and forth more often. Over time, this creates a background burden that is easy to overlook because it does not always appear as a dramatic event. Yet biologically, it can be costly. A body that must regularly manage infection, parasites, inflammation, or immune challenge is a body that cannot direct all its resources towards strength, growth, and repair. Energy is always limited. If more of it must be spent on defense, less of it remains available for maintaining maximum physical robustness. This is one reason the larger question of human weakness after the Ice Age cannot be answered only through bones, movement, or food. Disease ecology also matters. A more stable life can protect the body from some older dangers while quietly exposing it to newer ones. In that sense, the post-Ice Age world may have reduced certain forms of strain while introducing new low-level drains on the human organism. Archaeological evidence does not always give us a complete picture of specific illnesses in deep prehistory, and careful interpretation is necessary. But broader patterns are enough to suggest the logic. Longer occupation of sites, greater density of repeated use, accumulation of refuse, and closer long-term contact between people all create conditions in which infection and parasitic load can become more persistent features of life. Later, as human settlements became even more structured and animals were managed more closely, these pressures likely intensified further. The body then had to survive in a world where danger was no longer only the open cold or the long journey, but also the invisible, repeated stress of living within human-made environments. Looking again to the beginnings of human life, this marks a deep shift in where bodily strength was being spent. Earlier, humans often had to direct their resilience outward, toward movement, exposure, and scarcity. Later, humans in some regions increasingly had to divide that resilience, using part of it to manage the invisible biological costs of closeness, waste, and repeated contamination. This may help explain why later populations can appear, in some respects, less physically robust even when their world seems more stable from a distance. Stability is not always simple relief. Sometimes it changes the form of the burden. The human body after the Ice Age may have become less rugged not only because it moved less far or carried less often, but because it increasingly had to live under a quiet tax of disease pressure that earlier, more mobile worlds may have imposed less continuously. In that slow trade, one kind of toughness may have faded while another kind of survival took its place, leaving behind a body that was still deeply adaptive, but no longer hardened by the same clear and relentless frontier between itself and the world. As the body faced changing food, movement, and disease pressures after the Ice Age, another transformation was taking place beside it, one that did not begin inside the body at all. Humans were becoming better at placing tools, materials, and techniques between themselves and the direct force of the environment. In earlier prehistoric life, the body itself carried much of the burden of survival. Cold had to be endured by flesh and metabolism. Distance had to be crossed by legs and lungs. Food had to be found through movement, pursuit, and manual effort. Looking back to the deeper origins of our species, tools had always mattered, but for long stretches of human history they worked with the body rather than in place of it. A spear extended the arm, a cutting edge improved the hand, a fire warmed the body, yet the body still remained the main engine through which survival was achieved. During the Ice Age, even with remarkable ingenuity, this remained largely true. Clothing, shelters, and controlled fire could reduce exposure, but they did not remove the need for constant bodily resilience in landscapes that were cold, unstable, and physically demanding. After the Ice Age, however, as climates softened in many regions and human communities became more familiar with local environments, the role of tools and technology began to shift in a subtle but important way. Instead of only extending the body's immediate reach, they increasingly reduced the amount of direct physical adaptation the body itself had to maintain. Better shelters could protect against wind, rain, and temperature shifts. More refined clothing could reduce the body's need to endure cold exposure directly. Food processing tools could make calories easier to extract, chew, digest, and store. Containers and storage methods could protect resources across time, reducing the need for repeated emergency exertion. None of this happened at once, and none of it made the human body irrelevant. But together these layers began to change the balance between what the body had to do and what the surrounding human-made world could do for it. This matters because the body adapts to repeated necessity. If the environment once required thick layers of biological endurance and human-made systems begin to absorb part of that demand, then the body is no longer under the same pressure to preserve every older capacity at the same intensity. A body protected by clothing does not need to endure cold in the same way as a body exposed more directly. A body living with better shelter does not have to absorb every seasonal shift with the same physiological cost. A body supported by processed and stored food does not need to face the same repeated cycles of effort, scarcity, and recovery. Over generations, these differences can matter as much as changes in climate itself. Archaeological evidence reflects this broad transition through the growing variety and specialization of tools, the repeated construction of habitation spaces, and the signs of food preparation and storage that appear with increasing frequency in post-Ice Age settings. These traces suggest not only greater technical skill, but a new relationship between humans and necessity. The body was still central, but survival was becoming more distributed across objects, routines, and built environments. In a sense, humans were beginning to move part of their adaptation outside themselves. Looking again to the deeper human story, this may be one of the most important reasons later humans can appear less physically robust than those shaped by harsher prehistoric conditions. It is not simply that the body declined, it is that the body no longer had to carry the full weight of the environment alone. Human intelligence, memory, cooperation, and material culture had become strong enough to share that burden. The result may have been a slow reduction in the need for maximum biological hardiness, because the world was no longer met only with muscle, bone, and metabolism. It was increasingly met with fire, fabric, shelter, containers, and tools that softened direct exposure. In that sense, one answer to the title begins to sharpen here. Humans may have seemed weaker after the Ice Age, not only because the body changed, but because the body was gradually relieved of tasks it had once been forced to solve by itself. And when adaptation can be carried partly by the hand, the hearth, and the shelter, the body, honest as ever, no longer needs to remain as hard as the world once required. As tools and techniques became more reliable after the Ice Age, The most important change was not only that humans could do more, but that the body itself no longer had to solve every problem directly. In earlier prehistoric life, survival often depended on meeting the world through the exposed capacities of the body. Cold had to be endured through metabolism and movement. Hunger had to be managed through long travel, pursuit, gathering, and repeated manual effort. Shelter, when temporary or limited, reduced some danger but did not erase the body's direct contact with hardship. Looking back to the deeper origins of our species, this directness shaped the human organism for a very long time. Early humans used tools, certainly, but tools often amplified bodily labor rather than replacing it. The hand still had to strike, carry, scrape, lift, and move. The leg still had to cross distance. The body remained the central instrument of survival. After the Ice Age, however, in many regions the relationship between body and tool began to change in a deeper way. Human-made systems did not simply extend physical effort, they increasingly prevented certain hardships from reaching the body at full force in the first place. Better fitted clothing reduced exposure before cold could fully penetrate. More durable shelters reduced repeated stress from wind, rain, and temperature shifts before the body had to compensate internally. Improved containers and storage practices reduced the urgency of immediate foraging or pursuit. More effective cutting, grinding, and cooking tools reduced the amount of chewing, digesting, and raw processing that bodies once had to manage more directly. This is a subtle shift, but it matters greatly. When a tool only extends the body still carries most of the cost. When a tool begins to absorb part of the environment's pressure before it reaches the body, the balance of adaptation starts to move outward. Over time, this means the body is no longer being shaped only by landscape and climate. It is also being shaped by the buffer created by human skill and material culture. A body sleeping in better shelter is not the same as a body exposed to repeated cold nights in open terrain. A body eating food that has been softened, processed, or stored is not responding to the same physical and metabolic demands as one relying on more immediate and uncertain intake. A body protected by clothing and fire does not need to preserve the same level of raw exposure tolerance as one that must absorb more of winter directly. Archaeological traces support this larger pattern, even if they do not tell the whole story by themselves. Repeated evidence of habitation structures, specialized tools, controlled hearth use, storage features, and refined food processing implements all suggest that in many post-Ice Age contexts, humans were building environments that shared the work of survival. This does not mean bodily strength disappeared. It means the body was no longer the only place where survival was maintained. Part of human adaptation had begun to live outside the skin. Looking again to the earliest human story, this may be one of the most revealing transitions of all. For a very long time, the body had to remain prepared because the world reached it so directly. After the Ice Age, in many places that directness began to soften. The hand-shaped objects that reduced exposure. The group preserved knowledge that reduced uncertainty. The home space, however simple at first, reduced the body's constant need to improvise against the environment. Over generations, this changes what the body is asked to maintain. It does not need to hold the same reserve against cold, hunger, or strain if another layer now stands between it and the world. In that sense, technological life did not make humans weaker all at once. It slowly changed the place where strength lived. Some of it remained in bone, muscle, and endurance, but some of it moved into fabric, fire, stone, memory, routine, and built space. And once strength can exist outside the body as well as within it, the body no longer has to carry its older burden alone. Over many generations, one of the deepest changes after the Ice Age may have been that human adaptation slowly became divided between the body and the world humans built around it. Earlier in prehistory, especially under colder and more unstable conditions, the body had to remain the main site of survival. Strength was not only in tools or intelligence, but in what muscles, bones, metabolism, and endurance could do when faced directly with hunger, exposure, and distance. Looking back to the deeper origins of our species, humans had always used objects, fire, and shared knowledge. Yet for long stretches of time, these supports still left the body carrying most of the burden. A shelter could reduce wind, but the body still had to tolerate cold. A tool could cut or scrape more efficiently, but the body still had to move, carry, and endure long effort. During the Ice Age, Even remarkable ingenuity could not fully spare the body from the raw demands of the environment. After the Ice Age, however, that balance began to shift more clearly. In many regions, as climates became less severe and human communities became more rooted in familiar places, the things humans made began to do more than assist. They began to absorb. Clothing did not merely help the body stay warm, it reduced the amount of cold the body had to answer on its own. Shelter did not merely provide rest, it lowered the repeated stress of exposure before the body had to compensate. Stored food did not simply save time, it weakened the old link between immediate effort and immediate survival. Processed food reduced the physical work of chewing, digesting, and extracting nourishment. Repeated use of hearths and built spaces created micro-environments in which the body no longer met the landscape in its full force every day. This gradual movement of adaptation outward matters because the body follows what is repeatedly required, not what used to be necessary in the distant past. If part of the work once done by the body is now being done by tools, structures, and routines, then the body is no longer under the same pressure to preserve every earlier capacity at the same level. Over generations, this can contribute to a body that appears less rugged, not because it has failed, but because some of the burden of survival has been transferred elsewhere. In a sense, humans did not only adapt biologically after the Ice Age, they increasingly adapted materially. Strength began to exist in distributed form, shared between flesh and artifact, metabolism and memory, bone and shelter. Archaeological evidence gives this idea a clear foundation. Repeated habitation sites, improved food processing tools, storage features, refined clothing technologies inferred from implements, and more stable use of fire all point toward human environments that were becoming better at buffering the body. These were not luxuries in the modern sense. They were extensions of survival. But unlike earlier tools that mostly amplified bodily labor, these later systems increasingly reduced how much direct adaptation the body had to maintain. Looking again to the long human story, this may be one of the strongest reasons the body after the Ice Age can seem less robust than before. It was not living in the same direct contest with the environment. More of the contest had been moved outward, into things humans could build, preserve, repair, and pass on. The body was still human, still adaptable, still capable of hardship, but it no longer had to stand alone against cold, scarcity, and exposure in the way earlier bodies often did. In that sense, weakness after the Ice Age may not have been only a biological reduction. It may also have been the visible result of a profound human success. The more effectively people learned to place intelligence, tools, and shelter between themselves and the world, the less the body itself needed to remain the single hard frontier of survival. And once survival can be carried partly by the world humans make, the body is quietly freed to become something less harshly forged than it once had to be. The changes that followed the Ice Age did not happen in a single generation, and this may be one of the main reasons they are so easy to misunderstand. When people imagine weakness or strength, they often imagine something sudden, as if one kind of human body ended and another began. But the deeper human story rarely works that way. Bodies do not usually transform through dramatic breaks. They shift through repetition, through ordinary conditions encountered again and again, until those conditions begin to feel natural and then inherited. Looking back to the earliest origins of our species, this slow pattern was always there. Early humans were shaped not by one event, but by long contact with landscapes, climates, distances, and shortages that repeated themselves across many thousands of years. During the Ice Age, those repeating pressures remained strong in many regions. Movement had to continue, cold had to be endured, food had to be found without certainty. The body was reinforced by this repetition not because every day was identical, but because the general demands kept returning often enough to shape development and survival over long spans of time. After the Ice Age, the important point is not that everything changed at once, but that the background began to shift. Temperatures rose gradually. Ice retreated gradually. Forests, wetlands, grasslands, and coastlines changed at different speeds in different places. Humans did not wake into a new world in a single moment. Instead, generation after generation encountered conditions that were slightly less severe in some areas, slightly more stable in others, and increasingly open to new patterns of movement, food use, shelter, and settlement. This matters because the body is shaped most deeply by what continues long enough to become normal. A single hard winter does not define the species. 1,000 years of repeated conditions begins to do so. In the same way, a short period of easier access to food or shorter movement does not transform the body. But when such changes continue across many lifetimes, they begin to alter the average demands placed on development, work, recovery, and survival. The skeleton may become lighter. Endurance systems may be less constantly reinforced. The body may invest less in preserving traits that are expensive when not regularly required. None of this needs a dramatic turning point. It only needs time. Archaeology supports this view precisely because it rarely shows one clean divide between before and after. Instead, it reveals patterns that accumulate. Site use becomes more repeated in some places, food processing becomes more structured, tools become more specialized. Some bones become less robust across later populations. None of these changes alone explains the entire story. Together, they suggest a slow movement in the relationship between humans and their environment. Looking again to the deeper origins of our species, this is exactly how evolution and adaptation often leave their marks. The body is not rewritten in a single stroke. It is adjusted line by line through the ordinary pressures of life. This slow timescale also helps explain why the question in the title cannot be answered as a simple loss. Humans did not suddenly become weaker after the Ice Age. Rather, in many places, the world slowly stopped asking the same things of the body. The demands of cold, distance, scarcity, and direct exposure did not vanish everywhere, but their average intensity softened enough in some regions to redirect adaptation over time. The body, always responding to the most common conditions rather than to memory alone, followed that redirection. Returning once more to the long beginning of human life, this means that what we call weakness may sometimes be the final visible layer of a process so slow that no single person living through it could have recognized it clearly. A child grows in slightly milder conditions than the grandparents knew. That child's children grow with more predictable food, more familiar shelter, and more local movement. Many generations later, the body that stands in the same species is still recognizably human, still capable, still adaptable, but no longer pressed into exactly the same mold. In that sense, time itself may be one of the most important forces in this story, not because it changes the body by magic, but because it allows countless small differences in environment and behavior to settle into the body so deeply that they begin to look like nature. And perhaps that is why the weakening of the human body after the Ice Age, if it happened at all, did not arrive as a fall. It arrived as a long, quiet drift, almost invisible while it was happening, yet powerful enough to reshape what the body was gradually expected to be. When change unfolds slowly enough, it can pass through many generations without ever being noticed as change at all. After the Ice Age, this gradual transformation shaped not only the environment and human behavior, but also the conditions under which bodies grew from childhood into adulthood. Each generation did not inherit a finished form. It developed within a slightly altered world, one that carried forward small differences in climate, food access, movement, shelter, and exposure. Looking back to the deeper origins of our species, this process had always been central to human life. Early humans did not grow in identical conditions across time. Their bodies formed in response to the landscapes and pressures they experienced during development, which in turn influenced how they moved, worked, and survived. During the Ice Age, the recurring demands of cold, scarcity, and long-distance movement created a developmental environment in which the body was repeatedly challenged from early life onward. Growth took place under conditions that required resilience, not occasionally, but often enough to shape how muscles formed, how bones responded to load, and how energy systems adapted to fluctuation. After the Ice Age, however, as conditions became more stable in certain regions, the developmental environment itself began to shift. Children in some communities were born into worlds where the extremes of cold exposure might be less frequent, where food, while not always abundant, could be more predictable, and where movement might occur within more familiar and limited ranges. These changes did not remove hardship from life, but they altered its rhythm during the years when the body is most responsive to its surroundings. This matters because the human body does not only reflect genetic inheritance, it reflects the conditions under which it grows. Bone density, muscle development, endurance capacity, and even metabolic patterns are influenced by the types of stress and activity experienced during development. When those stresses become less constant or less severe, the resulting body may develop differently, even if the underlying biological potential remains. Over many generations, as similar conditions repeat, these developmental differences can begin to appear as broader population patterns. Archaeological evidence, when viewed across long timelines, suggests that some of these changes in skeletal structure and physical robustness align with shifts in lifestyle and environment. These are not sharp boundaries, but trends that emerge gradually, reflecting the cumulative effect of altered daily life. A child who grows in a setting with more predictable food, less constant long-distance movement, and more buffered exposure to the environment is not growing in the same biological context as one whose early life is shaped by repeated scarcity, cold, and continuous physical demand. Looking again to the earliest human story, this helps explain why the question of weakness cannot be separated from the question of development. The body is not only what it inherits, it is what it becomes through repeated interaction with its world. When that world changes, even slightly, the process of becoming changes as well. Over time, the average outcome shifts, not through a single decisive moment, but through the quiet accumulation of differences in how bodies are formed, used, and maintained. This perspective also reminds us that what appears as reduced robustness in later populations does not necessarily reflect a loss of capacity in an absolute sense. It may reflect a different set of developmental priorities shaped by new conditions. The body becomes aligned with what it expects to encounter most often. If extreme endurance is no longer required daily, it may not be reinforced to the same degree during growth. If energy does not need to be stretched across frequent scarcity, metabolic patterns may adjust accordingly. If exposure is buffered, tolerance may develop differently. Returning once more to the long arc of human history, this gradual shift in development shows how time operates not only across generations, but within them. Each individual body becomes a record of its immediate world, and as that world changes slowly over thousands of years, the human form changes with it, almost imperceptibly. What we call weakness may, in this light, be the result of countless small differences in how bodies were shaped from the beginning of life, each one too subtle to notice alone, but together enough to redefine what a typical human body becomes when it no longer grows under the same relentless pressures that once defined its past. What becomes most striking over very long stretches of time is that the human body does not need a single catastrophe or a single invention to become different. It only needs a new normal that lasts long enough. After the Ice Age, that new normal did not arrive with one clear border. It gathered slowly through repeated changes in weather, landscape, movement, food, shelter, disease, and social life. Looking back to the earliest origins of our species, the body had always been shaped this way, not by isolated moments, but by the steady return of certain demands across countless days. Early humans did not become resilient because of one harsh season. They became resilient because cold, effort, uncertainty, and exposure returned again and again, often enough to leave their mark on growth, survival, and reproduction. During the Ice Age, this repeated shaping remained intense in many places. The body was still being trained by distance, strain, and fluctuation. After the Ice Age, however, the repeated pressures began to change direction. The important point is that a body does not compare itself to a distant ancestor. It adjusts to what surrounds it now. If winters become less punishing in some regions, if food becomes somewhat easier to predict, if movement becomes more local, if shelter becomes more stable, and if tools begin to absorb more of the world's force, then each generation grows under conditions that are slightly different things. No single change may seem large enough to matter, but time gathers small differences with enormous patience. A child raised in conditions that are a little less severe does not become a different species. That child simply develops within a body that is not being pushed in quite the same way. If that pattern repeats over many generations, then what began as a slight difference in demand can become a visible difference in average robustness. This is why the question of whether humans became weaker after the Ice Age is really a question about accumulated ordinary life. Bodies are not only shaped by rare extremes, they are shaped most deeply by habits of living that repeat until they feel invisible. If strain becomes less constant, the body invests less in preparing for constant strain. If unpredictability becomes less severe, the body reduces how much it must hold in reserve. If survival is buffered by tools, shelter, routine, and cooperation, then the body no longer needs to carry the full old burden by itself. Over centuries and then millennia, this becomes more than a behavioral shift. It becomes a biological pattern written into bones, muscles, metabolism, and tolerance. Archaeology gives us this story not as a sharp line, but as a quiet layering. Lighter skeletons in some later populations, repeated occupation of sites, changing food systems, more structured tools, and increasingly buffered living environments all point toward a world in which the body is no longer being shaped by exactly the same intensity of exposure. None of these signs alone proves a simple decline. Together, they suggest a long drift in what human life required physically. Looking again to the deeper human story, this may be the most honest way to understand weakness. It is not always collapse. Sometimes it is the slow fading of a capacity that is no longer paid for by daily necessity. Biology is careful with its costs. It does not preserve expensive readiness forever when the surrounding world no longer justifies that expense. So what changed after the Ice Age may not have been a sudden loss of strength, but the gradual disappearance of the conditions that once kept strength at a higher baseline. Returning once more to the origins of our species, this means that the body we inherit today may still carry the memory of harder worlds, yet it has been shaped for a very long time by conditions that often asked less from it than those earlier worlds did. And when a softer demand becomes the ordinary rhythm of life for long enough, the body, without drama and without announcement, begins to treat that softer demand as reality itself. By this point, the question begins to turn back on itself. When we say that humans became weaker after the Ice Age, what exactly are we comparing and what do we mean by weaker? If earlier humans often carried denser bones, endured colder exposure, travelled farther on foot, and lived closer to the edge of scarcity, then in some physical respects they may indeed appear more rugged than many later populations. But ruggedness is not the same as superiority, and reduced robustness is not always the same as failure. Looking back to the deepest origins of our species, the human body was never a fixed ideal moving steadily downward. It was always a response to conditions. Early humans did not possess strength as an abstract virtue. Their bodies developed within worlds that repeatedly demanded certain capacities, and those capacities were reinforced because they were useful under those exact circumstances. During the Ice Age, many of those demands were severe and persistent. The body had to tolerate cold more directly, move across larger and harsher landscapes, withstand irregular food access, and remain functional despite repeated strain. In that context, what we call strength was partly the shape of necessity. After the Ice Age, however, the conditions changed in many places. Food could become more predictable, movement could become more localized. Shelter, clothing, fire, stored resources, and social structure could buffer the body from direct exposure. Disease burdens increased in some settled contexts, but even then the overall pattern was not a simple subtraction of power. It was a rearrangement of what the body needed to do most often. This is where the idea of weakness becomes more difficult. If a later human body is less dense in bone but more suited to a less mechanically demanding life, is that weakness or adaptation? If endurance for prolonged cold becomes less pronounced because clothing and shelter absorb more of the environment's force, is that a loss or a transfer of survival burden from flesh to culture? If metabolic systems no longer maintain the same readiness for repeated famine because food systems become more regular in some places, is that decline or efficiency? Looking again to the earliest human story, the answer may be that none of these changes can be understood honestly unless the surrounding world is included in the comparison. A body is only strong or weak relative to the conditions it must face. The heavy bones of earlier foragers were well matched to intense habitual loading. The lighter bodies of many later populations may have been equally well matched to more stable, buffered, or socially supported environments. One body is not simply the broken version of the other. Each is the outcome of different pressures. Archaeological and biological evidence support exactly this caution. Later humans in some contexts do seem less robust in skeletal terms than earlier humans. Yet at the same time, later populations often display other forms of adaptation, including greater social complexity, broader environmental control, and new ways of distributing survival across tools, structures, and shared systems. The body may be doing less of one kind of work because other parts of human life are doing more. Looking back again to the origins of our species, this is perhaps one of the most human patterns of all. Humans do not adapt only by changing the body, they adapt by changing the world around the body. Once that happens, physical comparison becomes harder to interpret. A person wearing tailored clothing, sleeping in shelter, eating prepared food, and living within a cooperative group may appear less physically hardened than an ancestor exposed more directly to the environment. But that difference reflects not only a weaker body, it reflects a different way of being human. So the question now is no longer only whether humans became weaker after the Ice Age, it is whether what looks like weakness might sometimes be the visible surface of a deeper transformation, one in which the body gave up some of its older hardness because human life as a whole had found other ways to endure. And if that is true, then the real comparison may not be between strong humans and weak humans, but between different kinds of adaptation, each honest to the world that shaped it. To ask whether humans became weaker after the Ice Age is also to ask where strength truly resides. If strength is measured only by how much cold a body can endure, how far it can walk without rest, how little food it can survive on, or how much mechanical strain its bones can absorb, then many earlier humans may appear stronger in direct physical terms than many who came later. But if strength is understood as the ability of a living being to remain matched to its world, then the picture becomes more complicated. Looking back to the deeper origins of our species, the human body was never meant to exist apart from context. From the beginning, it developed within an exchange between flesh and environment, need and response, pressure and adaptation. Early humans were not simply stronger because they belonged to an earlier time. They were shaped by conditions that repeatedly required certain forms of toughness. During the Ice Age, in many regions, those conditions included cold exposure, unstable food, long movement, and the need to go on functioning despite exhaustion or discomfort. Under such repeated demands, the body was organized in ways that favored durability under strain. After the Ice Age, however, the world in many places changed enough that a different kind of matching became possible. Food could become somewhat more predictable. Movement could become more local. Shelter, fire, clothing, storage, and shared routines could absorb some of the pressures that earlier bodies had to carry directly. At the same time, new burdens such as infection, crowding, and the hidden cost of more settled life began to appear. This means that later human bodies were not simply facing less of everything. They were facing a different arrangement of demands. Some old forms of physical hardness may have become less necessary, while other forms of adjustment became more important. A body no longer required to endure repeated direct exposure to freezing conditions may gradually lose some of that old hardiness, but that does not automatically mean it has failed. It may mean that the body is no longer investing so heavily in a capacity that the surrounding world has partly replaced through behavior, culture, and material protection. In the same way, bones that become lighter under lower habitual loading are not necessarily the mark of a damaged species. They may reflect a body that is no longer shaped by the same relentless mechanical demands. Looking again to the earliest human story, this is an important reminder that the body does not preserve difficulty for its own sake. It preserves what is paid for by repeated necessity. When necessity changes, the body changes with it. This is why weakness can be a misleading word. It suggests a falling away from some original ideal state, as though earlier humans represented a permanent standard and later humans simply drifted below it. But the evidence does not support such a simple moral line. Earlier bodies were more rugged in some ways, because they had to be. Later bodies were often less rugged in those same ways because human life had reorganized itself. Part of adaptation had moved outward into tools, shelter, social cooperation, and controlled environments. Part of survival was no longer carried by muscle, bone, and raw endurance alone. Looking again to the long beginning of our species, perhaps the more careful question is not whether later humans were weaker, but whether they were still honestly fitted to the worlds they inhabited. In many cases, the answer may be yes. A body can lose one kind of hardiness and still remain highly adaptive within a different environment, What changes is the form of the fit. This is why the contrast between Ice Age humans and later humans should not be treated as a simple story of decline. It may be better understood as a shift in where human resilience lived. Some of it remained in the body, some of it moved into culture, some of it became shared across communities, objects, memory, and routine. And once resilience no longer lives in exactly the same place, the body may look weaker to our eyes, even while still being deeply, precisely, and truthfully adapted to the world that now surrounds it. By the time we reach this point in the story, the word weaker begins to feel less like an answer and more like a test of how carefully we are willing to look. If we compare a later human body to one shaped by the cold, movement, hunger, and exposure of the Ice Age, then yes, in some visible respects the later body may appear less rugged. Bones may be lighter. Endurance, under repeated deprivation, may be less deeply reinforced. The body may no longer seem organized around the same raw tolerance for strain. But to stop there would be to compare bodies without comparing worlds, and the human story has never been written by bodies alone. Looking back to the deepest origins of our species, humans were always creatures of relationship, not only with climate and landscape, but with tools, memory, cooperation, and learned behavior. Even in earlier periods, strength did not exist in muscle alone. It also existed in knowing where to move, how to share food, how to use fire, how to protect children, how to remember seasons, and how to survive together when no single body could master the world by itself. During the Ice Age, however, much of that intelligence still had to work through a body under harsh, direct pressure. The body remained the main frontier between human life and the environment. After the Ice Age, in many regions that frontier began to change. Human life became more buffered, more structured, and more distributed. Shelter reduced exposure. Clothing reduced the cost of cold. Stored and processed food reduced some forms of immediate physical demand. Communities could support more variation in bodies and capacities. The body was still essential, but it was no longer standing alone in the same way. This is why the idea of weakness becomes so unstable under close attention. A body that does not need to carry the same load is not necessarily a failed version of an earlier one. It may simply be a body shaped by a different contract with the world. The stronger-looking body of the Ice Age reflects a time when survival demanded repeated direct endurance. The less rugged body of later periods may reflect a world in which survival was increasingly shared between the body and the human environment built around it. Looking again to the earliest human story, this is not a break from what humans are. It may be one of the clearest expressions of what humans are. Humans do not adapt only by becoming harder. They adapt by rearranging the burden of survival. Sometimes the body grows tougher. Sometimes the world around the body becomes more protective. Sometimes strength moves outward, into social life, material culture, routine, and knowledge passed between generations. If that outward movement happens slowly enough, the body itself may no longer need to preserve the old level of physical harshness. What remains can look like weakness if we only examine the body in isolation. Yet, in a fuller sense, it may be adaptation expressed across a larger system of life. This is why later humans may be honestly described as less robust in some physical ways, while still being deeply fitted to the conditions in which they lived. The body was not preserving every costly trait from the past because the past was no longer present in the same form. It was adjusting, with the same quiet honesty it had always shown, to a world that increasingly asked different things. Looking again to the long beginning of our species, perhaps the most careful answer is this. Humans may have become weaker after the Ice Age in certain physical respects, but that weakness was not necessarily a simple decline. It may also have been the visible shape of a profound human success, the success of learning how to survive with less direct punishment written into every bone and muscle. And if that is true, then the final question is no longer whether the body lost something, but whether what it lost was surrendered only because humans had already begun to place part of their strength somewhere beyond the body itself. By the time the long changes after the Ice Age had unfolded across thousands of years, the human body had become something like a layered memory. It still carried signs of older worlds even when those worlds were no longer present in the same form. The shape of the spine, the design of the foot, the endurance systems that can still respond when pushed, the ability to store and release energy under strain. All of these suggest that the body did not leave its prehistoric past behind. Instead, it brought that past forward into new conditions. Looking back to the deepest origins of our species, this makes sense. Humans were shaped over immense spans of time by movement, uncertainty, changing climates, and the repeated need to remain functional under pressure. During the Ice Age, many of those conditions were especially intense. The body had to endure direct exposure, unstable food access, long travel, and repeated physical strain. That history did not vanish when the ice retreated. It remained inside the organism as an inheritance of structure and potential. After the Ice Age, however, the body began living in worlds that no longer demanded the same things with the same regularity. Food could become more stable in some places, movement could become more local, shelter, fire, clothing, tools, and social routines could absorb part of the environment's force. Disease burdens changed, settlement patterns changed, population structures changed. Over many generations, the body responded honestly to those new conditions. It did not preserve every old form of ruggedness at full strength simply because that ruggedness had once been useful. Biology does not work by loyalty to the past. It works by repeated demand in the present, yet the older design was never erased completely. This is why the modern human body can feel strangely divided. Much of the time, it lives in buffered environments protected from direct cold, long hunger, and constant physical strain. And yet, under certain circumstances, it can still reveal capacities that seem older than ordinary life. People can endure more than they expect. Muscles can adapt when demand returns. Bones respond to repeated load. Metabolism still carries traces of a deeper history shaped by shortage and effort. Looking again to the earliest human story, this suggests that the body today is neither simply weak nor simply strong. It is a surviving form of an older creature, still carrying traces of a world that built it, even while living in conditions that rarely ask for its full inheritance. This may be one of the quiet lessons left by the Ice Age. The body is not only what it currently does, it is also what it was once repeatedly required to do. In that sense, the human frame today can be understood as a record of compromise between ancient pressure and later relief. Some of the old hardness faded because life changed. Some of the old capacities remained because evolution does not rebuild from nothing each time the environment softens. Instead, it modifies, reduces, repurposes, and carries forward. Archaeology and biology together support this careful view. Later, humans in many contexts do seem less physically robust than earlier populations shaped by harsher conditions. But the body still bears enough of its older design that those earlier worlds are not entirely lost. They survive in the architecture of joints, in endurance pathways, in the way physical training can wake dormant capacities, and in the lingering mismatch between what the body was built through and what daily life often asks of it now. Looking once more to the long beginning of human life, perhaps this is where the question becomes most meaningful. Humans may have become weaker after the Ice Age in some physical ways, but the weakness did not erase the deeper history written into the species. It only changed how often that history had to speak. The body we carry now may be quieter, lighter, and less harshly tested than the bodies of some distant ancestors, yet it still contains their outline, their burdens, and their unanswered inheritance. And perhaps that is why the story does not end with a simple loss, but with a more unsettling thought. If the ancient human body still lingers within us in partial form, then how much of what we call modern weakness is really the silence of unused strength? If the modern human body still carries traces of older worlds, then one of the most revealing questions is not only what has changed, but what still remains beneath ordinary life. The body today often lives in conditions that would have been unfamiliar to most of its distant ancestors. It is warmed before cold fully reaches it. It is fed before hunger becomes prolonged. It rests in built spaces, moves across softened ground, and often spends long periods without the kind of repeated strain that once shaped bone, muscle, and endurance from early life onward. Looking back to the deepest origins of our species, this contrast is striking. Early humans did not grow within a protective layer thick enough to keep the environment at a distance. Their bodies were formed by direct contact with uncertainty, movement, weather, effort, and incomplete recovery. During the Ice Age, many of those demands remained intense, and the body responded by maintaining forms of toughness that were reinforced through daily necessity. After the Ice Age, however, many of those pressures softened in some regions, and the body gradually adjusted. Yet adjustment is not erasure. This is important. Evolution does not simply remove old capacities the moment they are used less often. It leaves behind structures, tendencies, and dormant possibilities that can remain long after the world that once demanded them has changed. This is one reason the modern body can seem both reduced and unfinished at the same time. In ordinary life, it may appear less rugged than the bodies of earlier humans shaped by harsher climates, longer movement, and more direct scarcity. But under repeated challenge, it can still change in ways that reveal a deeper inheritance. Muscles strengthen when strain returns. Bones become denser when they are loaded again and again. Endurance improves when movement becomes sustained and necessary. Even tolerance for discomfort can shift when the body is repeatedly asked to continue. These responses do not mean that modern humans are secretly identical to Ice Age humans. They mean that the body still carries biological pathways shaped by a longer past than the modern environment usually requires. Looking again to the beginnings of human life, this helps explain why the body can feel mismatched to the conditions it now inhabits. It was not built from the start for stillness, constant comfort, and predictable intake. It was shaped across immense stretches of time by fluctuating energy, repeated movement, changing climates, and direct contact with the outside world. When daily life no longer calls on those older patterns, the body does not necessarily lose them entirely. It simply stops expressing them as often. Over generations, some ruggedness fades, some robustness declines, and some capacities are maintained at lower average levels because they are expensive to preserve without regular use. But the older design remains partly visible, like an outline beneath newer layers. Archaeology suggests that later human populations in many places became less physically robust than some earlier groups, especially in bone structure and habitual loading. Biology suggests that bodies still remain highly responsive to the right kinds of demand. Together, these two facts point toward a quiet conclusion. The modern human body is not only the result of becoming weaker, it is also the result of becoming less continuously tested. What looks like weakness may sometimes be the condition of a body living below the level of challenge that once shaped it more fully. Looking again to the long human story, this creates a deeper kind of uncertainty. If the body still contains capacities inherited from harsher worlds, then the boundary between weakness and unused potential may not be as clear as it seems. Perhaps part of what changed after the Ice Age was not that human beings lost all traces of their earlier strength, but that the world gradually stopped asking for that strength often enough to keep it close to the surface. And if that is true, then the modern body may be less a broken version of the past than a quieter one, carrying within it the memory of older demands, older endurance, and older forms of survival that still linger, not fully gone, but no longer called upon in the same relentless way. And so the question returns in its quietest form, not as a contest between ancient people and modern people, not as a simple story of decline, but as a long reflection on what happens when the world slowly changes the price of survival. Looking back across the whole span of this story, the pattern is now easier to see. During the Ice Age and in the older human worlds that led into it, the body was shaped by repeated direct demands. It had to endure cold with fewer barriers, move farther across unstable land, tolerate more uncertainty in food, and remain functional through fatigue, discomfort, and incomplete recovery. Those conditions did not produce a perfect human body, but they did help maintain a more physically rugged one in many populations, because the environment kept paying for that ruggedness day after day. After the Ice Age, the payments slowly changed. The climate softened in many regions. Food became more predictable in some places. Movement became more local for many groups. Shelter, clothing, fire, storage, tools, and shared routines began absorbing part of the burden that earlier bodies had to carry directly. Disease and crowding introduced new costs, and life did not become easy, but the overall shape of pressure shifted. Over many generations, the body responded with the same honesty it had always shown. It reduced what was expensive when no longer constantly required. It redirected energy toward the average conditions of a new world. Bones in many groups became lighter. Endurance and tolerance for hardship were no longer reinforced in exactly the same way. Physical robustness, where the environment no longer demanded it so relentlessly, could begin to fade. Yet the most careful answer is not that humans simply became weaker. The deeper answer is that human strength changed its location. Some of it remained in the body, some of it moved outward into culture, cooperation, material skill, and built environments. Humans survived not only by keeping the body hard, but by making the world around the body more protective, more predictable, and more shared. In that sense, what looks like weakness may also reflect one of the oldest human abilities of all, the ability to move part of survival outside the skin. This is why the story matters beyond prehistory. It reminds us that the body is never just a machine of muscle and bone. It is a living record of what life repeatedly asks from it. If life asks for endurance, the body leans toward endurance. If life asks for efficiency, it leans toward efficiency. If life asks for neither very often, then old capacities may grow quieter without vanishing completely. And that may be the most useful lesson hidden inside this long question. We should be careful when judging the human body by any single era, including our own. A body that appears less rugged may not be lesser in any simple sense. It may be adapted to a different contract with the world, but there is also a gentle warning here. Capacities that are no longer used often can become distant, and a species that forgets the conditions that shaped its body may begin to misunderstand both its limits and its possibilities. To know where humans came from is not to romanticize suffering, or imagine that hardship was noble by itself. It is to remember that much of what seems ordinary in our bodies was forged under conditions that were anything but ordinary. The educational value of this story, perhaps, is that human nature is not fixed at the point of comfort. It is broader, older, and more complex than daily life usually reveals. We are shaped by ancient pressures, modern buffers, and the long tension between them. So perhaps the body we carry now is neither simply weak nor simply strong, but a quieter descendant of a harsher past, still holding traces of ancient endurance beneath the surface of easier days. And if the world once made humans harder by asking more from every step, every meal, every season, then what kind of human body are we becoming now, in a world that asks less and less, yet never truly tells us what may disappear in the silence?